At my birthday brunch, my grandpa smiled and raised his glass, saying how happy he was that I loved the downtown penthouse he bought me. I stared at him and whispered that I lived in a flooded basement. My dad dropped his fork and the room fell into a dead silence as a $1 million lie unraveled. My name is Riley, 33 years old, and for my entire life I have been the scapegoat of my family. I work 70 hours a week as a freelance user experience designer, surviving on sheer willpower, while my parents treat me like an embarrassing secret. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who tried to destroy your life for their own benefit. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Chicago, appearances were absolutely everything to my parents. My father, Richard, runs a mid-tier logistics company and acts like he is corporate royalty. My mother, Linda, spends her days at the country club obsessing over designer labels and local gossip to maintain her social status. From the moment I chose to pursue digital design instead of corporate law or finance, they branded me a massive failure. They reserved all their praise, affection, and financial support for my younger sister, Madison. At 30 years old, Madison holds a fake advisor title at our dad company, a job that requires her to do absolutely nothing while collecting a massive six-figure salary. She is married to Terrence, an African-American man who confidently calls himself a tech startup founder. In reality, Terrence is just a smooth talker who burns through investor cash on projects that never materialize. They are the golden couple paraded around by my parents at every high society event, while I am shoved into the background and treated like the family disappointment. The confrontation that shattered our family illusion happened last Sunday. My grandfather Harrison had flown in from Florida to celebrate my 33rd birthday. Grandpa Harrison is a retired real estate mogul, a sharp and brilliant man who built a massive empire from absolutely nothing. He is the only person in our entire extended family who ever respected my hustle and independence. Because he was paying the bill, my parents enthusiastically booked a private dining room at a ridiculously expensive Michelin star restaurant in downtown Chicago. I arrived straight from a massive client deadline, physically exhausted, but genuinely happy to see my grandfather. I was wearing a simple 3-year-old navy dress that I thought looked perfectly fine and professional. My mother, Linda, took one look at me as I walked through the heavy oak doors and let out a dramatic theatrical sigh. She leaned across the table, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking loudly against her crystal champagne flute. "Riley, darling," she said, her voice intentionally loud enough for the hovering waiter to hear. "Did you really have to wear that outdated rag to a place like this? I offered to take you shopping last month. You look like you just crawled out of a discount thrift store." I swallowed my anger, took a deep breath, and calmly replied that I had been working back-to-back shifts and did not have time to go shopping for luxury clothes. Madison rolled her eyes and deliberately adjusted her brand-new designer bag on her lap so everyone could see the logo. "That is the exact problem with being a freelancer," Madison sneered, sipping her mimosa. "You have absolutely no stability." Terrence just secured another round of seed funding for his new app. "We are thinking about upgrading our luxury cars next week. Success really is about having a winner mindset, Riley. You should try it sometime." Terrence smirked, swirling his expensive scotch in his glass. He spent the next 20 minutes aggressively bragging about his imaginary tech empire, talking about valuation metrics and disruptive paradigms, while my father nodded along eagerly, like Terrence was the greatest genius of our generation. I sat quietly sipping my ice water, completely used to this exact toxic dynamic. I lived in a cramped, damp basement apartment in the deep suburbs that cost me $1,200 a month. The plumbing constantly leaked, and I had to shove old towels under the front door whenever it rained. But I paid for it myself, and that hard-earned independence was the only thing keeping me sane. Then the main courses were cleared away by the attentive staff, and the waiter brought out a beautiful chocolate cake. Grandpa Harrison smiled warmly, his sharp eyes crinkling at the corners. He stood up slowly and tapped his crystal water glass with a silver spoon. Everyone quieted down instantly, eager to hear the wealthy patriarch speak. I want to make a toast to my wonderful granddaughter Riley on her special day. He began, his voice filled with a genuine affection I rarely heard from anyone else. You have always been such a hard worker. You forged your own path, and you never asked anyone for a handout. That kind of resilience and grit is incredibly rare these days. I felt a heavy lump form in my throat. It was the first genuinely nice thing anyone had said to me all year. My grandfather continued looking directly into my eyes. That is exactly why I set up that trust fund for you. I know how tough the freelance world can be, and I wanted to make sure you always had a safe, luxurious place to call home. I am so incredibly happy you are enjoying the downtown Chicago penthouse I bought you 3 years ago. At least you never have to worry about making rent while you build your incredible business. The room froze entirely. The silence was so sudden and absolute that the soft background jazz music of the restaurant suddenly sounded deafening. I stared at my grandfather, completely baffled and disoriented. My mind raced frantically, trying to process his impossible words. Trust fund, downtown Chicago penthouse. 3 years ago, none of it made any logical sense to my reality. I looked at him, my voice trembling as I finally whispered, "Grandpa, what penthouse? I do not have a trust fund. I am renting a flooded basement apartment in the suburbs for $1,200 a month." The color instantly drained from my father Richard's face. He dropped his heavy silver fork, and it hit his porcelain plate with a loud, sharp clatter that echoed violently through the private dining room. My mother, Linda, looked like she had just seen a ghost, her jaw practically unhinged. Madison suddenly looked down at her lap, refusing to make eye contact with anyone, while Terrence stiffened in his chair, his arrogant smirk completely vanishing into thin air. Grandpa Harrison narrowed his eyes. The warm, grandfatherly expression vanished in a millisecond, replaced by the ruthless real estate tycoon who had crushed industry competitors for decades. He looked at my parents, then darted his gaze back to me. "What do you mean you live in a basement?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "I authorized the release of $1.5 million from your personal trust to purchase that exact penthouse on Michigan Avenue. Richard handled all the closing paperwork for you." My father started stammering uncontrollably, sweat actively beading on his forehead. "Dad, let me explain," he stuttered, holding his hands up defensively. There was a complication with the property taxes, and Riley was not ready for that kind of immense financial responsibility. "We made a strategic family decision." Grandpa Harrison did not even let him finish the pathetic sentence. He pulled his cell phone from his tailored suit jacket and dialed a number with furious precision. He slammed the phone onto the center of the dining table and hit the speaker button. The line rang twice before a crisp, highly professional female voice answered the call. "Vivian Cole, Trust and Real Estate Attorney." "How can I help you, Harrison?" My grandfather leaned forward, his voice dangerously calm and lethal. "Vivian, I need you to pull up the official property deed for the Michigan Avenue penthouse right now. Tell me exactly who is listed as the legal owner of that property." We waited in agonizing, suffocating silence for 10 long seconds while Vivian typed rapidly on her keyboard. The clicking stopped. "The property is currently registered to Terrence and Madison," Vivian announced clearly through the speaker. "Would you like me to send you the official documentation?" The blood drained from my father's face so quickly he looked physically ill. He did not even wait for the call to disconnect. He pushed his chair back so violently, it tipped over onto the plush carpet with a heavy thud. Before I could even process the massive betrayal that had just been exposed, my mother grabbed my left arm. Her perfectly manicured fingernails dug sharply into my skin. My father stepped around the table and grabbed my right arm with a bruising grip. They practically dragged me out of the private dining room, forcing me down the dimly lit, opulent hallway and shoving me directly into the vacant women's lounge of the restaurant. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind us, cutting off the soft jazz music from the main dining area. I stood there, rubbing my aching arms, staring at the two people who were supposed to protect and love me. Instead of offering an apology, my mother rounded on me with absolute fury. Her eyes were wide and her chest heaved as she pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "How could you do this to us, Riley?" my mother hissed, pacing aggressively across the polished marble floor. "You just humiliated this entire family in front of your grandfather. Could you not just play along for one single dinner? You always have to ruin everything with your dramatic victim complex." I stared at her, completely stunned by the sheer audacity of her accusation. My chest tightened, making it incredibly difficult to breathe. "You stole a $1.5 million penthouse that Grandpa bought for me." I fired back, my voice echoing off the expensive bathroom tiles. "You committed literal fraud, and you are mad at me for not playing along with your crime." My father stepped forward, towering over me, using the exact same intimidating physical presence he used on his warehouse employees. "It was a strategic family decision," he barked, as if that corporate buzzword justified committing a major felony. "Terrence is on the verge of securing a massive round of seed funding for his tech startup. He needs to host angel investors and venture capitalists at a premium location. He needs the optics of extreme success to close this critical deal. Investors do not hand over millions of dollars to a guy living in a basic suburban apartment. We put the penthouse in Madison and Terrence's name because they actually need the high society image to secure their future. You just sit behind a computer screen designing websites all day. You do not need a luxury address to do freelance work." The absolute cruelty of his logic hit me like a physical punch to the gut. They had literally stolen my inheritance to fund my brother-in-law's fake billionaire lifestyle. "So Terrence gets to play a successful tech founder using my stolen property?" I asked, my voice shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. "And what about me, Dad? What about my life? I have been drowning in $60,000 of student loan debt for 10 years. I work 70 hours a week, burning myself out just to make the minimum payments on loans you forced me to take out because you said you could not afford my tuition." My mother rolled her eyes, crossing her arms defensively. "We told you that digital design was a useless degree. We were teaching you financial responsibility. You needed to learn how the real world works." Financial responsibility. I practically screamed, the years of suppressed resentment finally boiling over. "When Madison graduated with a completely useless degree in art history, you bought her a brand new sports car as a graduation gift. You paid for her $100,000 destination wedding in cash. You gave her a fake advisory job at your logistics company so she could collect a massive paycheck for doing absolutely nothing. And you left me to rot in a flooded basement while you handed her my $1 million home." The heavy bathroom door swung open and Madison marched in. She did not look guilty. She did not look ashamed. She looked profoundly annoyed that her perfect evening had been interrupted. She was clutching her designer purse, her high heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "You are being entirely unreasonable," Riley Madison sneered, stepping right up to me with an entitled glare. "Terrence and I are building an empire. We are creating generational wealth for this entire family. You are just being selfish because you are jealous of our success and our marriage. Your success is literally built on a stolen apartment," I shot back, refusing to back down from her condescending stare. Madison let out a dramatic sigh, unzipping her expensive leather bag. She pulled out a sleek custom checkbook and a gold-plated pen. She scribbled something down rapidly, ripped the check from the binding, and threw it aggressively at my chest. It fluttered down to the wet marble floor near my cheap shoes. "There is $10,000, Madison said, her tone dripping with intense superiority. "Go buy yourself some new clothes and pay off a chunk of your little student loans. Consider it a generous gift. Now wipe your face, walk back out to that table and tell Grandpa Harrison that you willingly transferred the deed to us because you could not afford the maintenance fees. Fix this mess right now, or I swear to God Dad will use his corporate connections to make sure you never get another freelance client in this city again." They all stared at me, waiting for me to break. They expected me to lower my head, pick up the money, and surrender to their demands. They had conditioned me my entire life to accept their scraps and take the blame for their terrible behavior. I looked down at the $10,000 check lying in a puddle of water. Then I looked at my mother, my father, and the golden child sister who had stolen my entire future without a single ounce of remorse. I bent down slowly and picked up the piece of paper. Madison smirked, clearly thinking she had won the negotiation. Instead of thanking her, I gripped the edges of the check and tore it straight down the middle. I tore it again and again, until it was nothing but tiny shreds of worthless paper. I threw the confetti directly into Madison's perfectly contoured face. Before she could even react to the flying paper, I grabbed a heavy glass tumbler sitting on the bathroom vanity filled to the brim with iced lemon water meant for the lounge guests. With one swift, deliberate motion, I threw the entire glass of freezing water directly into Madison's face. She shrieked in absolute horror as the icy water ruined her expensive makeup and soaked the front of her silk designer blouse. My mother screamed, rushing forward to grab a towel while my father shouted my name in pure, unbridled rage. I did not stay to listen to their empty threats or their screaming. I turned on my heel and walked out of the bathroom, my head held high, my posture completely rigid. I marched down the hallway and strode back into the private dining room, fully prepared to tell my grandfather the entire unvarnished truth about their abuse. But when I reached our table, the room was empty. The expensive plates of untouched food were still sitting there, but Grandpa Harrison was gone. Terrence was nowhere to be seen either. The only thing left on the table was the black leather check presenter. I walked over to it, my heart pounding heavily against my ribs. Tucked under the heavy metal clip was a single crisp white napkin. On the back of the napkin, written in my grandfather's sharp, unmistakable handwriting, was a very short message. I packed my things, grabbed my coat, and read the note one more time just to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me. The message was incredibly clear, and it signaled the absolute destruction of my family's fraudulent empire. It simply read, "See you in federal court." I walked into the downtown high-rise the very next morning, my cheap boots sinking into the plush carpeting of the most intimidating law firm in Chicago. The glass double doors bore the name Cole and Associates in sharp silver lettering. I had not slept a single minute since walking out of that restaurant. My mind had been spinning with the sheer magnitude of the betrayal, replaying my father yelling about strategic family decisions while my mother dug her nails into my arm. I was exhausted, running on black coffee and pure adrenaline, but I stood up straight as the receptionist guided me down a long hallway overlooking the city skyline. Vivian Cole was waiting for me in a corner office that radiated absolute power. She was a striking woman in her late 40s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my entire annual rent. She did not offer me a warm, comforting smile or useless platitudes about how hard family drama could be. She pointed to a heavy leather chair across from her massive desk, which was already covered in neatly organized stacks of financial documents and legal binders. "Your grandfather called me the moment he left the restaurant yesterday," Vivian said, her voice crisp and completely devoid of emotion. "He authorized me to use the full weight of this firm to tear down whatever fraudulent structure your parents have built. We are not treating this as a family dispute, Riley. We are treating this as a hostile corporate takeover." She slid a thick manila folder across the polished mahogany desk. "Open it," she instructed. I opened the folder, my hands trembling slightly as I looked at the top document. It was a standard real estate transfer form, officially moving the deed of the Michigan Avenue penthouse from my personal trust fund into the names of Madison and Terrence. The paperwork was stamped, notarized, and legally binding. But that was not what made the blood freeze in my veins. "Look at the bottom of the second page," Vivian commanded, tapping her expensive pen against the paperwork. "Look at the authorization signature." I flipped the page and stared at the ink. There, sitting right above a printed line, with my full legal name, was a signature. It looked remarkably close to my handwriting, mimicking the sharp loops and the slight slant I always used. But it was not my signature. I traced my finger over the ink, a wave of profound nausea washing over me. "I did not sign this," I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly small in the massive office. "I have never seen this document in my entire life. Vivian nodded, her expression hardening into something predatory and dangerous. "I know you did not sign it," she replied, leaning back in her leather chair, "because doing so would require an overriding authorization to bypass the strict stipulations of the trust fund your grandfather set up. Your parents could not simply ask the bank to transfer the deed. They needed absolute legal authority to act on your behalf." She slid a second document across the desk, placing it directly next to the fraudulent deed transfer. "This is a durable power of attorney," Vivian explained. "It was filed exactly 3 years ago, right around the time the trust fund released the money for the penthouse." I read the legal jargon, my chest tightening with every single word. The document explicitly granted my father, Richard, complete control over my financial decisions, real estate holdings, and trust fund allocations. It essentially declared that I was willingly surrendering my financial autonomy to him. And right there at the bottom, heavily notarized and officially filed with the state of Illinois, was another perfect forgery of my signature. They forged my name to give my father total control over my life. I said, the reality of their crime fully crashing down on me. My own parents forged a legal document just so they could steal a luxury apartment and hand it to my sister. Vivian leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. They did not just forge a document, Riley. They engaged in a highly calculated multi-state criminal conspiracy. Your grandfather trust is based in Florida. The property is in Illinois. The electronic transfer of $1.5 million across state lines using a forged power of attorney is not a simple civil matter. This is federal wire fraud. It is identity theft. It is a severe felony that carries mandatory federal prison time. The words echoed in my head. Federal prison. My parents had been so blinded by their obsession with maintaining a fake high society image, so determined to prop up Terrence and Madison, that they had casually committed a federal crime. They had risked everything just to ensure their golden child could play house in a penthouse while I drowned in a flooded suburban basement. "We are going to file a civil suit to immediately contest the deed," Vivian continued, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute certainty. "But I am also preparing a comprehensive dossier to hand directly to the FBI. Your father thinks his logistics company and his country club connections make him untouchable. We are going to show him exactly what happens when you commit federal fraud against a trust fund managed by this law firm." I felt a sudden, fierce surge of vindication. For 33 years, I had been told I was the failure. I had been gaslit into believing my struggles were my own fault. But I was not the failure. They were criminals. Vivian turned to her dual computer monitors, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "As part of my preliminary investigation this morning, I ran a comprehensive title search on the penthouse to check for any outstanding liens or encumbrances." She noted, her eyes scanning the digital records. "I wanted to make sure Madison and Terrence had not racked up unpaid property taxes that we would have to clear once we seized the property back." She stopped typing. The predatory confidence on her face suddenly shifted into a look of absolute disgust. She let out a sharp, cynical laugh. "What is it?" I asked, leaning forward over the desk. "What did they do?" Vivian turned the monitor so I could see the screen. "They did not just steal the penthouse to live in it, Riley. Your brother-in-law, Terrence, is even more deeply involved in this scam than we thought. He used the stolen property as a personal ATM machine." I stared at the financial records displayed on the screen, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of what I was reading. It was a commercial loan agreement registered with a major national bank. Terrence had used the $1.5 million penthouse as direct collateral to secure a massive business loan. "He leveraged your stolen property to take out an $800,000 loan," Vivian stated, pointing to the heavily highlighted number on the screen. "He convinced the bank that he owned the property free and clear, and he used it to secure capital for his fake technology startup. Your sister and her husband are sitting on an $800,000 powder keg, and they are using your stolen inheritance to fund their luxurious lifestyle." I sat in the freezing dampness of my basement apartment 48 hours after my meeting with Vivian. My computer screen illuminated the dark room, casting a harsh blue glow across my exhausted face. I was aggressively coding the final beta version of an interface for my highest-paying corporate client, a project that was supposed to secure my financial stability for the entire year. Then a notification pinged. It was an email from their director of operations. The subject line read, "Contract termination." My heart skipped a heavy beat. I clicked open the message, scanning the cold, legally sanitized text, stating they were immediately severing all ties with my freelance agency due to unforeseen internal restructuring. Before I could even process the financial hit of losing a $20,000 project, a second email arrived from another massive client. It was the exact same script: contract canceled, services no longer required. In the span of 3 minutes, my entire projected income for the next 6 months vanished into completely thin air. My phone began to vibrate on the cheap particle board desk, the harsh buzzing sound startling me. The caller ID flashed my father's name. Richard never called me during business hours unless he needed to berate me or demand a favor for Madison. I swiped the green button and pressed the phone to my ear, my hand shaking with a mixture of dread and surging adrenaline. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat. A low, arrogant chuckle echoed through the receiver. "I assume you have checked your email by now," Richard said, his tone dripping with the kind of smug satisfaction he usually reserved for crushing his business competitors. "You did this," I stated. It was not a question. It was an absolute realization of how deeply malicious my own father could be. I did what any protective father would do when an ungrateful child tries to destroy her own family. Richard replied, his voice hardening into a vicious snarl. "You really thought you could hire some fancy downtown lawyer and wage war against us without consequences? I run a major logistics firm, Riley. I play golf with the chief executive officers of the very companies you beg for freelance scraps. It took me exactly 2 phone calls to dry up your entire revenue stream." I gripped the edge of my desk so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. "You are intentionally starving me out," I whispered, sickened by the reality of his ruthless strategy. "I am teaching you a necessary lesson about loyalty and hierarchy." Richard shot back with absolute venom. "Here is the deal. You are going to call your aggressive little attorney right now and drop this entire ridiculous lawsuit. You will sign a legally binding non-disclosure agreement stating the penthouse belongs to Madison and Terrence. You will walk away quietly, and maybe I will make another phone call to get your little design contracts reinstated. If you refuse, I will personally ensure you are permanently blacklisted from the entire digital design industry. You will never secure another freelance client in this state again. You will be buried in your student loan debt until they repossess whatever pathetic belongings you have left in that flooded basement." He paused, clearly waiting for me to break down. He expected the sound of muffled sobs. He expected the desperate apologies I had been conditioned to offer since childhood. Instead, a wave of profound, icy clarity washed over my entire body. "You think cutting off my money will force me to submit to you?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, steady whisper. "You think I am going to roll over and let you steal $1 million from me just so I can keep designing web pages for your corrupt country club friends?" Richard scoffed loudly into the receiver. "You have absolutely no leverage, Riley. You have no money, no clients, and no power. Do not be stupid. I will see you in federal court, Dad," I said, and immediately ended the call. I tossed the phone onto my desk and stared at the concrete wall of my apartment. Panic threatened to claw its way up my throat. My rent was due in exactly 5 days. My student loan provider was already sending warning notices. I had precisely $400 left in my checking account, and Vivian required a massive retainer fee to fast-track the federal filings and the civil litigation. Richard had calculated my financial ruin perfectly, assuming my poverty would force my immediate surrender. He had severely underestimated the survival instincts of a woman who had been fighting for her own life since the day she turned 18. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was a luxury I could no longer afford. I grabbed my keys, shoved my laptop into my worn backpack, and walked out to the muddy driveway where my 10-year-old sedan was parked. The car was a battered, reliable machine I had painstakingly paid off during my early 20s. It was my only mode of transportation, my only real asset aside from the stolen trust fund. I drove straight to a large used car dealership on the outskirts of the city. I did not haggle. I did not negotiate for a better price. I slammed the title onto the salesman's desk and demanded a direct cash buyout right then and there. 2 hours later, I walked out of that dealership with a cashier's check for exactly $8,000, leaving my only car sitting in their back lot. I took the city bus all the way back to the downtown financial district. The rain started pouring down, soaking through my cheap jacket by the time I reached the towering glass building of Cole and Associates. I bypassed the receptionist, marching straight down the hallway with a singular burning focus. I pushed open the heavy oak door to Vivian's corner office. She looked up from her dual monitors, her sharp eyes registering my soaking wet clothes and the unyielding fire burning in my expression. I walked straight up to her massive mahogany desk and slapped the $8,000 cashier's check down onto the polished wood. Richard just used his corporate network to kill my top 2 contracts, I announced, my voice echoing with pure lethal determination. He thinks starving me out will stop the lawsuit. He thinks I am completely paralyzed. Vivian looked at the check, then looked up at my face. A slow, predatory smile spread across her red lips. She recognized a fighter when she saw one. "Take the money," I instructed her, my gaze locked onto hers. "Do not wait for the standard civil court summons. I want you to bypass the normal procedures and hit them where it actually hurts. File the emergency asset freeze against Terrence right this second. Shut down every single bank account tied to that penthouse. Cut off the oxygen to his fraudulent startup and freeze every dollar he stole from my inheritance. Let my father see exactly what happens when he tries to starve out a woman who already knows how to survive in the dark." I sat on the edge of my thrifted mattress in my freezing basement apartment, watching the blatant delusion unfold in real time on my laptop screen. Madison was broadcasting live on Instagram. The high-definition video showed the sprawling $1.5 million Michigan Avenue penthouse dripping in excessive luxury. Waitstaff in crisp black uniforms circulated through the open-concept living room, carrying silver trays loaded with imported caviar and vintage champagne. The massive windows showcased the glittering Chicago skyline, a truly breathtaking view that was legally paid for by my grandfather trust fund. Yet there was my sister wearing a silk designer dress, twirling for the camera with a glass of sparkling wine in her hand. "Welcome to our official housewarming and seed funding gala." Madison squealed into the microphone, her perfect smile masking the absolute fraud of her existence. She flipped the camera lens to show Terrence. My African-American brother-in-law looked immaculate in a tailored charcoal tuxedo. He was standing near the custom marble kitchen island, aggressively pitching his non-existent technology startup to a group of wealthy, unsuspecting angel investors. He waved his hands enthusiastically, throwing around hollow buzzwords about disrupting the digital landscape. The investors nodded clearly, captivated by the illusion of extreme wealth the penthouse provided. Terrence was using my stolen property as the ultimate shiny lure to trap venture capitalists into handing over their cash. A new photo popped up on Madison's timeline. It was a perfectly staged family portrait. Richard and Linda stood proudly next to Terrence and Madison in front of the penthouse fireplace. My parents beamed with pure arrogance. The caption beneath the photo read, "Family is the ultimate foundation. So incredibly blessed to celebrate my brilliant husband and our beautiful new home. Thank you, Mom and Dad, for always supporting our massive dreams." I slammed my laptop shut, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. They were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, completely oblivious to the massive legal iceberg Vivian Cole was currently dragging directly into their path. I grabbed my heavy backpack and headed straight back to the downtown law firm. I had barely slept, but the adrenaline surging through my veins made me feel entirely invincible. When I walked into Vivian's corner office, Grandpa Harrison was already there, sitting rigidly in a leather guest chair. His posture was straight, and his sharp eyes burned with a terrifying quiet fury. He had refused to fly back to Florida, demanding to stay in Chicago until he personally witnessed the absolute destruction of my parents' fraudulent house of cards. Vivian was standing by the window reviewing a fresh stack of documents delivered by a forensic accountant she had hired. She turned around as I entered, her predatory smile returning. The emergency asset freeze was approved by the federal judge exactly 20 minutes ago, Vivian announced, her voice ringing with lethal satisfaction. The banks have officially locked down every single account tied to Terrence and Madison. Their credit cards will start declining before they even finish serving dessert at that ridiculous pitching party. I let out a heavy breath, feeling the first real wave of triumph. But Vivian held up her hand, signaling she was not finished. The smile faded from her face, replaced by a look of sheer cold disbelief. When we subpoenaed the financial records to execute the freeze, the forensic accountant uncovered something completely absurd. Vivian continued, walking back to her mahogany desk. We knew Terrence took out an $800,000 commercial loan using your stolen penthouse as collateral. But what confused us was how he managed to avoid defaulting on that massive debt. Terrence has zero legitimate income. His tech startup generates absolutely no revenue. The monthly interest payments on a high-risk commercial loan of that size are astronomically high. The bank would have foreclosed on the penthouse months ago if he missed a single payment. Grandpa Harrison leaned forward, resting his hands heavily on his wooden cane. So how exactly has that fraudster been keeping the bank off his back? He demanded. Vivian slid a printed financial ledger across the desk toward me. I looked down at the highlighted columns. The numbers documented a series of massive, frantic wire transfers funneling directly into Terrence's business account on the first of every single month. I traced the routing numbers back to their source, my chest tightening as the horrible, pathetic truth finally clicked into place. My parents, I whispered, staring at the bank statements in total shock. Richard and Linda have been paying the interest on his loan. They have been doing a lot more than just paying it, Vivian corrected sharply. Your father logistics company has been hemorrhaging money for the past 2 quarters. He did not have the liquid cash to cover Terrence's debts. So Richard and Linda quietly liquidated their entire retirement accounts. They drained every single penny they had saved for their old age. When that money ran out 3 months ago, they took out a massive second mortgage on their own suburban mansion just to keep funneling cash to Terrence. I stared at the paperwork, completely mesmerized by the sheer magnitude of their stupidity. My parents, who had constantly lectured me about financial responsibility, who had viciously mocked me for taking out student loans to pay for my education, had literally bankrupted themselves. They had willingly destroyed their entire financial future just to maintain the illusion that Madison was married to a successful tech founder. They threw away their entire retirement just to keep up appearances, Grandpa Harrison said, his voice dripping with pure disgust. They are funding a sinking ship just so they can brag at the country club. Vivian tapped the frozen account notices. And now that the federal judge has frozen Terrence's accounts, the bank will immediately realize the collateral is tied up in a massive fraud investigation. The bank will instantly call in the entire $800,000 loan. Terrence cannot pay it back. Richard and Linda have no retirement funds left to bail him out. I looked at the printed photo of Madison Instagram post sitting on Vivian's desk. Family is the ultimate foundation. They were throwing a lavish party, sipping expensive champagne, completely unaware that the financial ground beneath their feet had already disintegrated. They were not building an empire. They were all sitting together on a massive ticking time bomb, and the timer had just hit 0. The private elevator glided silently up to the top floor of the Michigan Avenue high-rise. I stood between Vivian Cole and 2 broad-shouldered Cook County Sheriff deputies. My heart was pounding a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs, but my hands were completely still. The paralyzing fear that had dictated my entire life was gone, replaced by an armor of absolute, frigid certainty. The elevator chimed softly, and the heavy, brushed steel doors slid open, revealing the private foyer of my stolen penthouse. The heavy double doors leading into the main living space were propped wide open to accommodate the caterers. A wave of loud, arrogant laughter and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes washed over us. I stepped right through the entryway, my cheap boots sinking into the imported Persian rug that my sister had undoubtedly purchased with stolen funds. The penthouse was packed with Chicago elite. Men in bespoke tailored suits and women draped in designer silk milled around the massive open-concept living room. In the center of it all, standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the glittering city skyline, was Terrence. He was holding court with a group of older, wealthy-looking men, aggressively gesturing with his hands as he pitched his non-existent tech startup. My parents, Richard and Linda, stood nearby, practically glowing with borrowed pride. And there was Madison wearing a diamond necklace and a smug proprietary smile, holding a silver tray of appetizers. She spotted me instantly. The smug smile evaporated from Madison's face, replaced by a contortion of pure, unadulterated rage. She shoved the silver tray into the hands of a passing waiter and marched straight toward the entryway, her high heels stabbing the hardwood floor. "What the hell are you doing here?" Madison hissed, keeping her voice low so the investors would not hear her. "I told you to stay away from us. You are not ruining my husband pitching event because you are jealous and broke. Get out of my house before I call building security." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply stood aside, allowing the two uniformed sheriff deputies to step fully into the light of the entryway. The sight of the badges and utility belts caused an immediate ripple of shock through the nearest guests. The polite networking chatter began to die down, replaced by a tense, murmuring confusion. My parents noticed the sudden shift in the room atmosphere. Richard and Linda pushed their way through the crowd, their faces draining of color the second they saw the police escort standing firmly by my side. "Officer, there has been a massive misunderstanding," Richard said, instantly adopting his authoritative country club executive voice. He tried to physically block the deputies from stepping further into the room. "This is a private corporate event. My daughter is emotionally disturbed and prone to these kinds of dramatic outbursts. I will handle her right now. Just step outside and I will make sure the building manager clears this up." The lead deputy did not even blink at my father's condescending tone. He looked right past Richard and locked eyes with Madison. "Are you Madison?" he asked, his voice booming over the quiet music. Madison swallowed hard, her eyes darting frantically toward Terrence, who had stopped his pitch and was now staring at the doorway in total shock. "Yes," she stammered, crossing her arms defensively. "I am the owner of this property." "No, you are not," I stated clearly, my voice carrying across the silent room. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bearing the heavy red seal of a federal judge. I walked right past my father, ignoring his desperate attempt to grab my arm. I marched straight to the massive custom marble kitchen island, swept a tray of expensive caviar onto the floor with the back of my hand, and slammed the documents down onto the stone surface. "This is a court-ordered emergency eviction notice," I announced, looking dead into Madison's panicked eyes. "You have exactly 48 hours to pack whatever cheap clothes you actually paid for and vacate my property. The locks will be changed on Tuesday morning and anything left inside will be thrown directly into a dumpster." Terrence rushed over his charismatic founder facade, completely shattering. He let out a loud, forced laugh, turning back to his bewildered investors. "Just a little family drama, gentlemen. Please enjoy the champagne. My sister-in-law has a history of mental health struggles." He reached out to grab the eviction notice, but Vivian Cole stepped right up to the marble island and slapped her hand down on top of the paperwork, stopping him dead in his tracks. "I highly advise you not to touch that document," Vivian said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Vivian turned her back on my family and faced the crowd of wealthy investors. She stood tall, a legal shark who had completely cornered her bleeding prey. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption to your evening." Vivian projected her authoritative voice, commanding the absolute attention of every single billionaire in the room. "My name is Vivian Cole. I am the lead trust and real estate attorney for Cole and Associates. I am advising all of you to set down your drinks and exit this premises immediately." The investors exchanged alarmed glances, their instincts immediately recognizing the severe danger in her tone. The man you know as Terrence is currently the subject of an active federal fraud investigation. Vivian continued relentlessly, dealing the fatal blow. This penthouse was stolen from my client through forged legal documents and identity theft. Furthermore, Terrence has illegally used this stolen property as collateral to secure commercial loans for his fraudulent startup company. Terrence let out a choked gasp, his hands flying to his head as he stumbled backward. Richard and Linda looked like they were going to faint right there on the Persian rug. Madison began to hyperventilate, clutching her diamond necklace as if it could somehow protect her from the incoming destruction. "I am warning all of you right now," Vivian said, her eyes scanning the terrified faces of the angel investors. "Any capital injected into this fake company will be instantly flagged by the federal government as participation in a criminal conspiracy. The bank accounts tied to this man were frozen by a federal judge less than an hour ago. If you hand him a single dollar, you will be subjecting yourselves, your corporate entities, and your personal assets to an immediate full-scale audit by the IRS and a subsequent investigation by the FBI." The impact of the letters IRS and FBI dropping in a room full of wealthy businessmen was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. It was like shouting fire in a crowded theater. The investors did not ask questions. They did not wait for Terrence to explain or defend himself. They dropped their champagne flutes onto the tables and scrambled toward the front door in a blind, terrified panic. They pushed past my screaming mother and my frozen father, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of a federal fraud case. Terrence lunged forward, grabbing the sleeve of an older investor who was rushing toward the exit. "Wait, please, it is a lie. I have the pitch deck. I have the metrics." The investor violently yanked his arm out of Terrence's grip. "Do not ever contact me or my firm again," the man snarled, disgusted. "You are a complete liability." Within 90 seconds, the sprawling, luxurious penthouse was entirely empty of guests. The catered food sat untouched. The champagne went flat. The only people left in the room were the two deputies, my ruthless lawyer, and my completely ruined family. Their fake empire had just been burned to the absolute ground, and the fire was only just beginning to spread. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse stood wide open, framing the absolute devastation we had just unleashed. I did not leave immediately. I stood perfectly still next to Vivian Cole, watching the glorious, catastrophic implosion of the people who had treated my life like disposable garbage. The silence left behind by the fleeing investors was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Madison hyperventilating on the Persian rug. Then Terrence's cell phone began to ring. The sharp, obnoxious corporate ringtone echoed through the massive living room. Terrence stared at the device in his hand like it was a live grenade. He swiped the screen with trembling fingers and pressed it to his ear. I watched the remaining blood drain completely from his face. His jaw went slack and his eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. The voice on the other end of the line was loud enough that I could hear the sharp, aggressive tone even from several feet away. It was a senior executive from his commercial bank. The automated federal asset freeze had triggered a massive internal alarm across their entire lending department. The bank had instantly discovered that the primary collateral for Terrence's $800,000 loan was now classified as stolen property under a federal fraud investigation. "No. Listen to me, you cannot do that," Terrence begged, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "I just need 48 hours to restructure the capital. I have investors lined up. We are finalizing the term sheets right now." The banking executive did not care about his pathetic lies. The voice on the phone delivered the fatal blow, officially calling in the entire balance of the commercial loan, effective immediately due to a severe breach of contract and suspected criminal fraud. The bank was seizing whatever digital funds were left and initiating immediate legal action to recover the rest. The line went completely dead. Terrence lowered the phone, his hands shaking violently. The charismatic, polished technology founder facade did not just slip, it completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. He let out a primal, deafening roar of absolute rage. He turned around and hurled his expensive smartphone directly at the floor-to-ceiling window. The device shattered against the reinforced glass, raining plastic and metal shards onto the hardwood floor. Madison screamed, covering her face as Terrence completely lost his mind. He grabbed a tray of half-empty crystal champagne flutes from the marble kitchen island and swept it onto the floor with a violent sweeping motion. Glass exploded everywhere. He kicked a velvet bar stool, sending it crashing into the custom cabinetry. His billion-dollar startup, his entire fake identity, had just been vaporized in a single phone call. Terrence spun around, his chest heaving, and directed his explosive, unrestrained fury squarely at my parents. He pointed a trembling, accusing finger directly at my father. "You told me the paperwork was bulletproof," Terrence screamed, his voice raw and echoing with panic. "You swore to me that the forged power of attorney was completely untraceable. You said you had total control over her trust fund and that no one would ever question the deed transfer. You promised me this collateral was entirely safe." Richard took a frightened step backward, raising his hands in a pathetic attempt to pacify his enraged son-in-law. "Keep your voice down, Terrence," my father hissed, glancing nervously at the two uniformed deputies who were watching the entire meltdown, with their hands resting casually on their utility belts. "We can fix this. I have lawyers. I have connections. We just need to assess the damage and create a mitigation strategy." "Fix this!" Terrence shrieked, taking an aggressive step toward my cowering father. "There is no fixing this. The bank just called in an $800,000 commercial loan. The federal government has frozen my accounts. The IRS is going to tear my entire life apart. I am looking at a decade in a federal penitentiary because you and your greedy wife could not forge a single document correctly. You guaranteed me this luxury address so I could secure funding, and now I am completely ruined." Linda burst into loud theatrical tears, clinging to Richard's arm. Madison scrambled to her feet, trying to grab her husband's shoulder. "Baby, please calm down," she sobbed, her diamond necklace glittering mockingly against her ruined silk dress. "We will figure it out. My parents will sell their house. They will bail us out." Terrence shoved Madison's hand away with intense disgust. "They do not have a house anymore, you idiot," he spat, exposing the final humiliating truth to the entire room. "They took out a second mortgage just to pay the interest on my bank loan. They liquidated their entire retirement. Your parents are as broke and pathetic as you are. I am done with this entire fraudulent family." I turned to Vivian, a cold, satisfied smile touching the corners of my mouth. We had seen enough. The infection was finally killing the host. I thanked the deputies for their service and walked out of my penthouse, leaving my family trapped in the burning wreckage of their own unparalleled greed. The eviction notice gave them 48 hours to vacate the premises, but Terrence did not plan on sticking around to face the devastating consequences. The cowardice that defined his entire existence took full control over the next 12 hours. Terrence knew the federal authorities would be coming for him next. He knew the bank would seize every tangible asset he possessed to cover the massive defaulted loan. While Madison spent the entire night locked in the master bathroom, sobbing hysterically on the marble floor and frantically calling her parents for a financial bailout that would never come, Terrence systematically and ruthlessly dismantled their shared life. He did not pack his clothes or his useless business documents. He packed survival capital. Working in total silence, Terrence stripped the penthouse of every single high-value, easily liquidated item he could get his hands on. He emptied Madison's designer jewelry box, taking the diamond tennis bracelets, the gold watches, and the platinum rings my parents had foolishly gifted her over the years. He packed up the expensive electronics, the limited edition sneakers, and a hidden safe containing $20,000 in emergency cash that was supposed to be their safety net. He stuffed a large duffel bag with a fortune in stolen goods, fully intending to pawn them on the black market to fund his escape from federal jurisdiction. He did not leave a single note. He did not say goodbye to the woman he had promised to build an empire with. When dawn finally broke over the Chicago skyline, casting a cold gray light through the massive penthouse windows, Madison emerged from the bathroom with red, swollen eyes. She called out for her husband, expecting him to comfort her, expecting him to have a magical solution to their sudden poverty. But the apartment was dead silent. Madison walked into the master bedroom, and found the empty jewelry boxes scattered across the unmade bed. The safe was hanging wide open, completely cleaned out. Terrence had vanished into thin air, with everything of value leaving his pampered, delusional wife, completely abandoned. Madison collapsed onto the floor of the empty, sealed apartment entirely alone, with absolutely nothing left to her name but an impending federal indictment and an eviction notice bearing my signature. The torrential Chicago rain pounded relentlessly against the tiny ground-level window of my basement apartment. I sat at my cheap particle board desk, wrapping my hands around a steaming mug of black coffee, listening to the violent storm raging outside. It had been exactly 72 hours since I walked out of that stolen penthouse, leaving my family to suffocate in the toxic smoke of their own burning empire. The federal asset freeze had triggered a massive chain reaction, and the local news networks were already reporting on a sweeping federal investigation into a prominent logistics executive. My phone had been completely silent, shielded by a new number and strict blocking protocols. I finally felt a profound, untouchable sense of peace. Then a frantic, aggressive pounding echoed down the concrete stairwell leading to my front door. I set my coffee mug down, the dark liquid rippling from the heavy vibrations. Nobody knew my address except my grandfather Harrison and Vivian Cole. I walked slowly toward the entryway, the cold linoleum freezing against my bare feet. I peered through the foggy security peephole. Standing on the flooded concrete landing, completely drenched by the freezing downpour, was my mother. Linda was completely unrecognizable. The woman who religiously attended country club luncheons and obsessed over maintaining a flawless, wealthy aesthetic looked utterly destroyed. Her expensive beige trench coat was soaked through, clinging heavily to her shaking frame. Her custom-highlighted hair was plastered flat against her skull, and dark streaks of expensive mascara ran down her pale cheeks like dirty river water. She was shivering violently, her luxury leather handbag clutched to her chest as the storm battered her without any mercy. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door open just a few inches, leaving the heavy brass chain firmly engaged. The freezing wind immediately whipped into the hallway, bringing the smell of wet asphalt and pure desperation. "Riley!" My mother gasped, her voice cracking as she grabbed the edge of the doorframe with desperate white-knuckled fingers. "Thank God you are here. Please, you have to let me inside. I am freezing." I did not move a single muscle. I stood perfectly still, blocking the entryway, looking down at the woman who had happily financed my sister's lavish lifestyle using my stolen identity. "Why are you here, Linda?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or familial affection. My mother let out a loud, pathetic sob and did something I never thought I would witness in my entire lifetime. She collapsed directly onto the muddy, flooded concrete landing. She fell to her knees in the freezing rain, ruining her designer clothes, burying her face in her hands as she wept hysterically. "The FBI raided your father's logistics company this morning," Linda wailed, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Dozens of federal agents stormed the corporate headquarters. They confiscated every single computer, every hard drive, and all the financial ledgers. They dragged Richard out of the boardroom in handcuffs right in front of his entire executive staff. He is sitting in a federal holding cell right now, Riley. They are charging him with wire fraud and criminal conspiracy. The bank is moving to foreclose on our house by the end of the month because the asset freeze blocked our mortgage payments. We have absolutely nothing left." She reached out her shaking, mud-stained hands, grasping blindly at the hem of my jeans. "You have to call your ruthless lawyer and stop this," Linda begged, her voice reaching a shrill, frantic pitch. "You have to drop the civil suit and tell the federal prosecutors it was all just a massive family misunderstanding. I carried you in my womb for 9 months, Riley. I gave birth to you. I raised you. I am your mother. You cannot send your own flesh and blood to a federal penitentiary. Families forgive each other. You have to show some mercy before they take everything away from us." I stared down at her pathetic, trembling form. The rain continued to violently wash over her, but I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no lingering childhood desire to comfort her. The emotional manipulation that had controlled me for 33 years was completely dead-buried under the crushing weight of my $60,000 student loan debt and the blatant theft of my grandfather trust fund. Mercy. I repeated softly, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. Did you show me mercy when I was drowning in debt, working 70 hours a week just to keep the lights on in this miserable flooded basement? Did you show me mercy when you forged my legal signature to steal a $1.5 million penthouse so Madison could play rich? Did you think about family loyalty when you sat at that Michelin star restaurant and publicly called me a worthless failure in front of our entire extended family? Linda choked on a sob, shaking her head frantically. We made a mistake, she cried out, ignoring the rain pounding against her face. We were just trying to help Terrence secure his business funding. We were protecting the family image. I am begging you, Riley. I will be homeless. I will have to sleep on the street. Please, you have to save us. You did not make a mistake, I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy storm with absolute surgical precision. You made a highly calculated, malicious choice. You weighed my life against Madison vanity, and you gladly threw me to the wolves. You built a fraudulent empire on my back, and now that the foundation has completely collapsed, you want me to shield you from the falling debris. I reached into the front pocket of my cardigan. I had picked up a stack of mail earlier that afternoon, and I remembered exactly what was sitting on top of the pile. I pulled out a glossy trifold brochure and slipped it through the narrow gap in the doorway. The paper fluttered down and landed directly in the muddy puddle next to her bruised knees. Linda stared at the brochure, her tear-filled eyes struggling to read the bold print in the dim light. It was an informational pamphlet for a county-subsidized low-income housing program and emergency homeless shelter located in the industrial district of the city. What is this? My mother whispered, her voice trembling with a new horrifying realization. You spent my entire life telling me that my dreams were stupid, I replied, staring directly into her broken, terrified eyes. You constantly told me that I needed to grow up, stop playing on computers, and be realistic about your financial situation. I grabbed the heavy brass handle of the door, preparing to shut her out of my life permanently. Well, Mom, I said, delivering the final fatal blow without a single ounce of hesitation. I highly suggest you take your own advice. Be realistic about your new living arrangements. I slammed the heavy door shut, twisting the deadbolt securely into place, and walked back to my hot coffee, leaving her completely alone to drown in the freezing storm she had created. Terrence thought he could easily outsmart the federal government. After fleeing the luxurious penthouse with a heavy duffel bag stuffed full of stolen designer jewelry, luxury watches, and whatever emergency cash he could scrape together from the hidden safe, his grand escape lasted exactly 48 hours. He was apprehended by law enforcement at O'Hare International Airport while frantically trying to board a one-way flight to a country with absolutely no extradition treaty. Now he was sitting in a freezing, windowless interrogation room at the FBI field office in downtown Chicago. Two stern federal agents laid out the devastating evidence against him across a cold metal table. They showed him the commercial bank fraud documents, they showed him the severe wire fraud charges, they showed him the flight to avoid prosecution paperwork. They clinically outlined a potential 30-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Terrence was a profound coward who had built his entire adult identity on the fragile illusion of wealth and unearned corporate power. Faced with the harsh, undeniable reality of a concrete cell and a stainless steel toilet, his steadfast loyalty to Madison and her manipulative family evaporated instantly. He looked at the federal agents, his hands shaking uncontrollably in his lap, and begged to know what kind of plea deal they could offer him to save his own skin. The lead agent smiled coldly. They did not just want the fake startup founder, they wanted the arrogant mastermind who successfully orchestrated the fraudulent transfer of the massive trust fund. They wanted Richard. To secure a significantly reduced sentence, the African-American self-proclaimed tech genius eagerly agreed to wear a concealed recording device. He quickly became an active, willing informant for the federal government, fully prepared to stab his wealthy in-laws directly in the back, to preserve his own freedom. The FBI meticulously arranged for Terrence to meet my father under the strict premise of coordinating their impending legal defense strategies. Richard, currently operating under a massive delusion of invincibility after posting an exorbitant bail from an initial residential raid, agreed to meet Terrence at a discreet, dimly lit steakhouse on the industrial outskirts of the city. Richard arrogantly assumed Terrence was coming to beg for a coordinated legal bailout. When Terrence slid into the heavy leather booth across from his father-in-law, he was sweating profusely. A tiny high-definition microphone was taped securely beneath his tailored dress shirt, transmitting every single breath and nervous tremor directly to an FBI surveillance van parked 2 blocks away in a dark, quiet alley. Richard looked at Terrence with absolute, unfiltered disgust, swirling a glass of incredibly expensive bourbon. He immediately started berating Terrence for panicking aggressively, calling him weak and incompetent for letting the commercial loan default so quickly. Terrence swallowed hard, fighting his rising panic, and desperately remembered the exact script the federal agents had drilled into his head. He needed a direct, unequivocal confession to save himself from decades behind bars. Terrence leaned across the polished wooden table, keeping his voice appropriately low and frantic to match the tense atmosphere. "They are threatening to pin the entire forgery operation on me," Richard Terrence whispered, playing the role of a desperate, terrified man perfectly. "The commercial bank is telling the federal investigators that I personally orchestrated the deed transfer to secure my massive loan. You have to tell them I had absolutely nothing to do with the actual paperwork. You promised me the asset was completely clean. I just signed the loan papers. I never touched the trust fund documents." Richard scoffed loudly, taking a long, arrogant sip of his bourbon. His legendary ego, the exact same toxic pride that had driven him to ruin my life and steal my inheritance, completely overrode his basic common sense. "You spineless idiot," Richard hissed, leaning closer to Terrence, entirely oblivious to the federal microphone resting just inches away from his mouth. "You actually think the federal government believes a failed bankrupt startup founder could bypass a highly secured $1 million real estate trust fund? I handled the entire transfer process from start to finish. I personally drafted and printed the durable power of attorney. I sat at the heavy oak desk in my home office and forged Riley's signature with my own 2 hands. I practiced her handwriting for hours until it was absolutely flawless." Richard leaned back against the leather seat, looking overwhelmingly smug and utterly superior. "I took that forged document to the company notary the very next morning and forced them to stamp it. I gave you the keys to the kingdom, Terrence. I handed you $1 million asset on a silver platter, and you blew it because you could not manage to pay the interest on a simple commercial loan. Do exactly what my high-priced lawyers tell you to do, keep your mouth completely shut, and I will make sure we all get out of this intact." In the cramped surveillance van 2 blocks away, the federal agents pulled off their heavy headphones and started making immediate, urgent phone calls to the federal prosecutor. They had the ultimate smoking gun. It was a direct, voluntary, crystal-clear recorded confession to federal identity theft, wire fraud, and massive criminal conspiracy. The very next morning, Richard walked into the massive glass-walled boardroom of his logistics company. He was wearing his best-tailored power suit, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable confidence as he addressed his nervous board of directors. He was standing at the head of the long mahogany table, delivering a grand, sweeping speech about corporate resilience and navigating minor legal misunderstandings. He was desperately trying to reassure his wealthy shareholders that his leadership was secure and that the company's stock would not plummet. Richard raised his hands confidently to emphasize a critical point about his future revenue projections. He never got to finish the sentence. The heavy glass doors of the executive boardroom were violently shoved open, shattering the quiet corporate atmosphere. A tactical team of federal agents wearing heavy, bulletproof vests, emblazoned with bright yellow letters, stormed directly into the room. The lead agent completely bypassed the terrified, gasping board members, marching straight up to my father with a heavily stamped legal document gripped firmly in his hand. Richard's face went completely gray, all the arrogant color draining away instantly as the federal agent slammed the search warrant down onto the mahogany conference table, officially announcing that his corporate empire was about to be completely dismantled. The federal raid on Richard Logistics Company was the final nail in the coffin of my family fraudulent empire. But my sister Madison was a creature built entirely on public perception and social validation. With her husband Terrence sitting in a freezing federal holding cell and our father facing massive felony charges, Madison had absolutely nowhere to run and no stolen money left to hide behind. She was cornered, humiliated, and utterly desperate to regain control of the narrative. So she turned to the only weapon she had left in her pathetic manipulative arsenal: social media. Less than 24 hours after the FBI stormed the corporate boardroom, my phone started vibrating violently on my kitchen counter. It was not just one or two notifications. It was a relentless, chaotic flood of alerts that caused my device to overheat. I opened my primary social media account and saw that I was being aggressively tagged in thousands of comments. Madison had uploaded a highly produced, heavily filtered video to her massive following. She was sitting on the floor of her childhood bedroom at our parents' suburban mansion dressed in an oversized beige sweater, looking entirely disheveled and fragile. She had perfectly manufactured tears streaming down her pale face as she stared directly into the camera lens, playing the ultimate victim. "My older sister Riley has completely destroyed our family," Madison sobbed, her voice trembling with practiced theatrical devastation. "She has always been fiercely jealous of my happiness and my marriage. But I never thought she would stoop to elder abuse to get her sick revenge. She has completely isolated our sick, elderly grandfather. She manipulated his declining mental state, brainwashing him into believing horrific lies about my husband and my parents. She used his wealth to freeze our bank accounts and illegally evict me from my home right after I had a baby. She is stealing his fortune while his mind is slipping away, and she is sending my innocent father to prison to cover her tracks." The video was an absolute masterclass in psychological manipulation. Madison weaponized the internet perfectly. She painted me as a greedy sociopathic monster exploiting a helpless senior citizen. Within a few short hours, the video went massively viral. The algorithm pushed it to millions of strangers who thrive on digital outrage and quick judgments. My inbox was instantly paralyzed by a massive tsunami of pure, unadulterated hatred. I received hundreds of direct messages from angry strangers calling me a gold digger, a sociopath, and a criminal abuser. Distant relatives who had never bothered to speak to me in 10 years suddenly emerged from the woodwork, leaving vicious voicemails demanding that I release my grandfather from my toxic control. They threatened to report me to Adult Protective Services. They threatened to destroy my freelance business by leaving fake, ruinous reviews on my professional website. The internet mob was hungry for blood, and Madison had served me to them on a silver platter. I did not shed a single tear. I did not respond to a single hateful comment or try to desperately defend myself in the comment section. Arguing with a digital mob is a losing battle. I simply took a screen recording of Madison, pathetic slanderous video, grabbed my car keys, and drove straight to Vivian Cole downtown law office. When I walked into the corner office, Grandpa Harrison was already there enjoying a cup of black coffee while reviewing a stack of civil litigation paperwork. I walked straight up to the mahogany desk, placed my phone down in front of him, and hit play. Grandpa Harrison watched the entire video without blinking once. He listened to Madison cry fake tears and boldly claim to the entire world that his mind was slipping away. He listened to his favorite spoiled granddaughter publicly declare that he was a weak, senile old man, incapable of making his own financial decisions. The silence in the office was absolutely terrifying. Grandpa Harrison did not yell. He did not throw anything. The legendary real estate tycoon simply finished his coffee, set the porcelain cup down, and looked at Vivian with a gaze so cold it could freeze the ocean. "Vivian," my grandfather said, his voice quiet, but echoing with immense, lethal authority. "Call your best videographer. Get them up to this office right this second. I am going to remind my arrogant family exactly who holds the power in this bloodline. Within 60 minutes, a professional camera crew was set up perfectly in the center of the law firm. The lighting was sharp and immaculate. Grandpa Harrison sat behind the massive mahogany desk, wearing a tailored navy suit, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying dominance. He looked dead into the camera lens, and the recording began. My name is Harrison, and I am speaking directly to the millions of people who recently watched a slanderous video posted by my granddaughter Madison. He stated, his voice ringing with crystal clear, undeniable strength. Madison claims that my mind is failing. She claims that I am being manipulated and abused by her sister Riley. Let me assure you, I have never been more lucid, more furious, or more aware of the sheer greed infecting my own bloodline. He reached to his right and picked up a thick stack of medical documents bearing the official seal of the most prestigious neurological institute in the state. He slammed the heavy medical file down onto the desk so hard the sound cracked through the audio feed. These are comprehensive court-certified cognitive evaluations conducted by 3 independent board-certified neurologists just 48 hours ago, Grandpa Harrison announced, staring fiercely into the lens. They confirm that my mental acuity is operating at 100% capacity. I am not senile. I am not being manipulated. I am fully aware that my son Richard and his daughter Madison systematically stole a $1.5 million property from my trust fund using forged federal documents. They committed massive financial fraud, and now they are crying on the internet because I caught them red-handed. He leaned forward entirely, commanding the frame, preparing to deliver the final, absolute death blow to my father's arrogant legacy. To my son Richard, who allowed this criminal behavior to flourish under his roof, hear me very clearly. Grandpa Harrison declared, his voice slicing through the silence like a sharpened blade. You are a disgrace to our family name. Effective immediately, I am legally severing all ties with you. My attorneys have already finalized the paperwork. I am permanently striking you, your wife Linda, and your daughter Madison from my last will and testament. You will not receive a single cent of my fortune. You are entirely dead to me. Good luck in federal court. The fluorescent lights of the downtown legal deposition room hummed with a sterile, suffocating energy. I sat perfectly still at the massive mahogany conference table, my hands folded neatly in my lap. A certified court reporter sat in the corner, her fingers hovering over a stenography machine, ready to permanently record the absolute destruction of my father. Richard looked entirely unrecognizable. The arrogant, untouchable logistics executive who had mercilessly mocked my freelance career just weeks ago was completely gone. His tailored suit hung loosely on his dramatically thinned frame. His skin was sallow, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He sat next to a highly paid defense attorney who already looked utterly defeated before the questioning even began. My father was currently out on federal bail facing severe criminal charges, but today was about the civil litigation. Today was about stripping away every single lie he had ever told. Vivian Cole sat beside me, radiating the terrifying calm of an apex predator circling a wounded animal. She adjusted her thick legal binder, picked up a pristine silver pen, and stared directly into my father's terrified eyes. Please state your full legal name for the record, Vivian ordered, her voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly. Richard Thomas Anderson, he muttered, his voice barely rising above a pathetic whisper. Vivian did not waste a single second on pleasantries. She immediately slid a clear plastic folder across the polished table. Inside the folder rested a high-resolution copy of the forged durable power of attorney. Mr. Anderson, I am showing you Exhibit A. Vivian stated, her tone sharp and unrelenting. Do you recognize this document? It is a legal authorization filed with the state of Illinois granting you absolute financial control over your daughter trust fund. Do you confirm that you personally submitted this paperwork to the bank holding the Michigan Avenue penthouse deed. Richard, defense attorney, held up a hand. My client invokes his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination regarding the origins of that specific document. Vivian smiled a razor-thin, predatory smile. That is perfectly fine, counselor, because we already have the federal wiretap transcripts where your client explicitly bragged to his son-in-law about forging the signature with his own two hands. We do not need him to confess to the forgery today. We need him to explain the malicious intent behind his financial terrorism. Richard flinched violently at the mention of the wiretap. The realization that Terrence had betrayed him to the FBI was clearly still an open, bleeding wound. Vivian leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. You are a wealthy man, Mr. Anderson. Or at least you were. Your logistics company generated millions in revenue last year. You lived in a sprawling suburban mansion. You had access to massive lines of corporate credit. So tell me, why did you orchestrate a highly illegal multi-state federal fraud scheme to steal a property from your own flesh and blood? Why did you not just take out a legitimate business loan to fund Terrence and his fake startup? I was protecting my family. Richard snapped, a sudden, desperate flash of his old arrogance flaring up. I was managing our assets. Terrence needed the right optics to secure his venture capital. It was a temporary reassignment of property. We were going to put it back in her name eventually. Vivian slammed her hand down on the table, the sharp crack making Richard physically jump in his seat. Do not insult my intelligence and do not lie under oath in this room, Vivian commanded, her voice echoing with lethal authority. You drained your own retirement accounts. You took out a second mortgage on your own home to pay the interest on a fraudulent loan. You were drowning in debt. You stole the penthouse because you were desperate to maintain a pathetic illusion of high society wealth. But out of everyone in your life, out of all your wealthy country club friends and corporate investors, why did you target Riley? The room went dead silent. The court reporter fingers flew across the keys. I stared directly at my father, refusing to look away. I wanted to hear him say it. I needed to hear the exact depth of his cruelty recorded on the official legal record. Why? Riley? Vivian pressed, her voice dropping to a dangerous, demanding register. Why did you choose to financially execute your eldest daughter? Richard's face contorted with a mixture of profound shame and uncontrollable rage. His defense attorney reached out to grab his arm, silently pleading with him to remain quiet, but the psychological pressure had completely broken his fragile mind. Richard slammed his fists onto the table, his eyes locking onto mine with burning, unapologetic resentment. I did it because I thought she was too weak! Richard screamed, his voice cracking violently under the immense pressure. I thought she would just take it. She has always been quiet. She has always been a pathetic disappointment living in a flooded basement. She spent her entire life begging for our approval. I chose her because I knew she did not have the money to fight back. I knew she would just cry and accept her place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. I chose her because I thought she would never dare sue her own family. The confession hung in the freezing air of the deposition room. It was the absolute, unvarnished truth. He had preyed on me because he thought my empathy was a weakness. He thought my desire for a loving family made me an easy, disposable target. I did not shed a tear. I did not flinch. I just looked at him with a feeling of profound, glacial emptiness. You were wrong, Dad. I stated, my voice completely steady and entirely devoid of mercy. I am the strongest person in this room, and I am the one who is going to bury you. Richard slumped back into his leather chair, breathing heavily, his face buried in his trembling hands. He had just handed us the exact motive required to utterly destroy him in civil court and secure maximum punitive damages. His defense attorney looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear completely. Well, Mr. Anderson, Vivian said, her tone returning to a terrifying surgical calm. I appreciate your candor. However, there is one final item we need to address on the official record today. Vivian reached into her briefcase and pulled out a fresh, heavily redacted bank statement. She slid it across the mahogany table. It stopped directly in front of my father. Richard looked down at the paper, his exhausted eyes struggling to focus on the highlighted numbers. While the FBI was seizing your corporate ledgers, my forensic accountants were digging into your wife's personal banking history. Vivian announced, her voice ringing with absolute lethal precision. We wanted to see exactly where the stolen funds were flowing before the federal freeze took effect. It turns out that your wife Linda is not just a passive accessory to your criminal conspiracy. She is a highly active participant. Richard looked up, utter confusion masking his face. What are you talking about? He stammered defensively. Linda had nothing to do with the financial transfers. I handled the trust fund. Vivian smiled, a cold, unforgiving smile. That is what you thought, Richard. But the banking records tell a very different story. Exactly 48 hours after you illegally transferred the deed to the penthouse, your wife initiated a secondary unauthorized wire transfer. She secretly siphoned exactly $50,000 out of the stolen commercial loan funds. She did not use that money to pay the mortgage. She did not use it to help Terrence's fake startup. Vivian leaned forward, delivering the ultimate relationship-shattering blow. Linda transferred $50,000 of stolen money into a secret offshore shell account registered exclusively under Madison's name. Your wife and your golden child daughter stole from you while you were busy stealing from Riley. They used that stolen cash to fund a massive high-end designer shopping spree in Paris while you were sitting here orchestrating federal fraud to protect them. Your perfect family has been robbing you blind this entire time. The atmosphere inside the sprawling suburban mansion was completely suffocating. The grand custom-built house that had served as the ultimate symbol of my parents' arrogance and social superiority was now an active crime scene of their own making. Following the disastrous deposition, the walls were rapidly closing in on Richard and Linda. The secondary mortgage they had recklessly taken out to cover Terrence and his massive commercial loan interest had officially defaulted. Without the stolen trust fund money or the logistics company revenue to keep them afloat, the bank moved with ruthless mechanical precision. The grace periods were exhausted. The automated warnings had expired. The financial guillotine was dropping. Richard paced the length of the immaculate formal living room like a trapped feral animal. His federal bail conditions restricted his travel, and the crushing weight of the impending criminal trial was visibly destroying him. He needed liquid cash immediately. His high-priced defense attorney had demanded a massive non-refundable retainer fee the second they walked out of Vivian Cole's deposition room. Without that money, the lawyer threatened to formally withdraw from the case, leaving Richard to face the federal prosecutors with a randomly assigned public defender. A public defender was a concept that terrified a man used to country club privileges. Linda sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her face buried in her hands. The revelation of her secret offshore account during the deposition had completely shattered their marriage. Richard had screamed at her for hours upon returning home, accusing her of hoarding stolen cash while he risked federal prison. But the offshore account was completely frozen by the authorities anyway, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the physical assets sitting in their 4-car garage. We still have the vehicles, Richard announced, suddenly his eyes darting toward the frosted glass of the garage door. We have the brand new Mercedes-Benz S-Class and your Range Rover. They are paid off. We can call that luxury auto broker in the city. He offered me a direct cash buyout last year. We can liquidate both vehicles today, secure the defense attorney retainer, and use the rest to rent a discreet townhouse until this entire federal investigation blows over. Linda looked up, her tear-stained face reflecting a pathetic glimmer of hope. She nodded frantically, grabbing her designer coat. It was a desperate, transparent attempt to cling to survival. They hurried toward the garage, Richard pulling his cell phone from his pocket to make the call that would supposedly save them from total ruin. They hit the electronic garage door opener, the heavy metal rising to reveal the manicured concrete driveway. But the luxury auto broker was not the one waiting for them. 2 massive, heavy-duty commercial tow trucks were already backed into the driveway, their diesel engines rumbling loudly in the quiet, affluent neighborhood. Standing directly in front of the vehicles were four agents wearing dark windbreakers, bearing the bright, unmistakable yellow letters of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Richard dropped his phone onto the concrete. He lunged forward, waving his arms frantically. "What are you doing?" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic. "You cannot take those vehicles. Those are private property. You have absolutely no jurisdiction here." The lead IRS agent did not even blink at my father's pathetic display of authority. He stepped forward, handing Richard a thick, heavily stamped federal warrant. "We have every jurisdiction, Mr. Anderson," the agent stated, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "You are currently under federal indictment for wire fraud and identity theft. Furthermore, you have massive unreported tax liabilities tied to the misappropriation of a highly regulated trust fund. The federal government has officially placed a comprehensive lien on all of your physical assets. These vehicles are being impounded by the Internal Revenue Service to cover mandatory restitution and pending tax penalties." Linda shrieked in absolute horror as the tow truck operators secured heavy metal chains to the axles of her beloved Range Rover. The loud metallic clanking echoed down the pristine suburban street. Wealthy neighbors began stepping out onto their front porches, hiding behind perfectly trimmed hedges, eagerly watching the spectacular, humiliating downfall of the neighborhood's most arrogant couple. Richard stood completely frozen on the driveway, his mouth opening and closing as he watched his final financial lifeline being dragged away down the street. But the universe was not finished punishing them. Before the tow trucks even turned the corner, a dark green Cook County Sheriff cruiser pulled directly up to the curb, its lights flashing ominously. Two uniformed deputies stepped out of the vehicle, walking purposefully up the long brick pathway leading to the massive front doors of the mansion. Richard and Linda turned around, their faces entirely drained of blood. The lead deputy held a brightly colored neon orange document. "Mr. and Mrs. Anderson," the deputy announced loudly, making sure the lingering neighbors could hear every single word. "The bank has officially finalized the foreclosure proceedings on this property due to severe default on your secondary mortgage. You are hereby ordered to vacate the premises immediately." "We need time," Linda wailed, falling to her knees on the expensive brick walkway. "We have nowhere to go. You cannot just throw us out into the street. We need to pack our clothes." "You had 30 days of written notice delivered via certified mail," the deputy replied coldly, stepping around her to approach the heavy mahogany front door. "You have exactly 5 minutes to gather any essential medications and personal identification. Everything else remains inside the property to be auctioned by the bank." Richard and Linda stumbled blindly into the house, grabbing 2 garbage bags from the kitchen and frantically shoving whatever basic clothing and toiletries they could find into the thin plastic. The deputies escorted them right back out the front door exactly 5 minutes later. The loud, definitive click of the heavy deadbolt locking behind them sounded like a gunshot. The deputy slapped the bright neon foreclosure notice directly onto the beautiful mahogany wood, sealing their absolute ruin. As my parents stood shivering on the front lawn, clutching black garbage bags filled with wrinkled clothes, an ordinary yellow taxicab pulled up to the curb. The back door swung open, and Madison stepped out onto the wet asphalt. My sister looked entirely destroyed. Her hair was a tangled mess. She was wearing the same wrinkled silk designer dress she had worn during her disastrous penthouse party. Terrence had completely abandoned her, stealing every piece of jewelry, every watch, and every dollar of emergency cash they had hidden in their safe. She had begged the taxi driver to bring her to the suburbs, fully expecting to run crying into the safe, wealthy arms of her powerful parents. She expected a warm bed, a hot meal, and a financial bailout. Madison dragged her 2 massive, heavy Louis Vuitton suitcases up the driveway, her high heels clicking unevenly on the pavement. She stopped dead in her tracks. She looked at the empty garage. She looked at the bright neon foreclosure notice taped to the front door. Finally, she looked at Richard and Linda, who were standing on the manicured grass holding actual garbage bags, looking like complete vagrants. "Mom," Madison whimpered, her voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched sob. "Terrence left me. He took everything. I need to come home." Linda looked at her golden child daughter, the daughter she had committed federal fraud to protect, the daughter she had sacrificed my entire life to elevate. A harsh, broken sob escaped my mother's throat as the absolute reality of their situation finally crushed them all. "There is no home," Madison Richards stated, staring blankly at the cold, gray suburban street. "We have absolutely nothing left." The three of them stood frozen on the sidewalk, surrounded by the mocking stares of their wealthy former friends. They had no money, no vehicles, no shelter, and absolutely no power. The flawless, arrogant family that had proudly thrown me to the wolves was now entirely homeless, shivering together in the cold, facing the exact same brutal, unforgiving reality they had forced me to survive for my entire life. Terrence sat on the sagging mattress of a cheap, heavily stained motel bed on the industrial outskirts of Chicago. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap bleach, a devastating downgrade from the $1.5 million penthouse he had illegally occupied just weeks prior. He stared at the heavily redacted federal plea agreement sitting on the cracked laminate nightstand. He had done exactly what the FBI demanded. He wore the concealed wire. He walked straight into that dimly lit steakhouse and manipulated Richard into a full, undeniable recorded confession. He completely sold out his arrogant father-in-law to save his own skin, fully expecting the federal prosecutors to grant him absolute immunity. But the federal government did not hand out free passes for massive commercial bank fraud. His overworked public defender had called him earlier that afternoon with the brutal, unforgiving reality of his situation. The prosecutors were recommending a mandatory 4-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. 4 years locked in a concrete cage. For a man who had built his entire existence on tailored suits, expensive champagne, and the fragile illusion of being a billionaire tech founder, 4 years was an absolute death sentence. Terrence realized with crushing clarity that his cowardice had only delayed his destruction, not prevented it. Panic, raw and suffocating, seized his entire body. He refused to wear a prison uniform. He refused to lose the best years of his life paying for a failed fraud scheme. Terrence walked over to the cheap laminate dresser and unzipped a battered black duffel bag. Inside rested the absolute last of his survival capital. It was a thick stack of $100 bills, the remaining cash he had acquired by pawning Madison designer jewelry on the black market before the federal asset freeze fully locked down his digital footprint. He had exactly $15,000 in untraceable currency. It was not enough to rebuild his fake empire, but it was enough to vanish. He reached into the front pocket of the duffel bag and pulled out a small, dark blue booklet. It was a highly sophisticated, incredibly expensive forged passport he had procured through a shady underground contact in the city. The document bore a completely different name, a different birth date, but featured his photograph perfectly laminated on the identification page. He had spent days meticulously researching international extradition laws. He had purchased a one-way first-class ticket to a remote island nation that strictly refused to cooperate with the United States Department of Justice. Once his plane touched down on that tropical runway, the FBI, the commercial bank, and his ruined homeless in-laws would never be able to touch him again. Terrence swapped his usual tailored suit for a nondescript gray hoodie and a dark baseball cap, pulling the brim down low over his eyes to obscure his face. He grabbed the heavy duffel bag, abandoned the motel room key on the bed, and walked out into the freezing night air. He paid a random taxi driver in pure cash, instructing him to take the longest, most convoluted route possible toward Chicago International Airport. The international terminal at the airport was a chaotic, swirling ocean of frantic travelers, loud intercom announcements, and rolling luggage. Terrence stepped out of the taxi, pulling his collar up against the biting wind. He kept his head down, blending perfectly into the massive crowd of exhausted tourists and business executives. He walked past the ticketing counters, feeling a sudden, intense surge of his old toxic arrogance flooding back into his veins. He was actually going to pull this off. He had successfully outsmarted the ruthless federal prosecutors. He had completely sidestepped Vivian Cole and her predatory legal tactics. He was going to leave his pathetic, penniless wife Madison crying in a suburban street while he drank cocktails on a pristine, untouchable beach. He navigated the winding security maze with practiced ease, clutching his fake passport and his boarding pass tightly in his sweating hand. The line moved agonizingly slow every second, heightening the massive adrenaline spike pounding in his chest. He could see the final security checkpoint just a few yards away. The Transportation Security Administration officers were routinely scanning documents and waving passengers through the metal detectors. Terrence stepped up to the designated podium. He forced his facial muscles to relax, painting on the charming, disarming smile he had used to swindle countless angel investors. He handed his forged blue passport to the uniformed officer behind the thick plexiglass shield. The officer did not smile back. He took the document, swiped it through the digital scanner, and glanced briefly at the computer monitor. "Please look directly into the camera lens for the biometric facial recognition scan, sir," the officer instructed, his voice entirely flat and mechanical. Terrence swallowed hard. He stepped onto the yellow footprints painted on the linoleum floor and stared directly into the small, glowing green camera lens mounted above the podium. He held his breath, waiting for the familiar, comforting chime of approval. He mentally prepared to grab his heavy duffel bag and sprint toward his departure gate. The machine did not chime. Instead, the glowing green light instantly flashed a violent, blinding red. A sharp, high-pitched digital alarm buzzed directly onto the officer's secure computer monitor. Terrence felt his stomach completely drop out of his body. The officer's eyes widened as he read the urgent, glaring red text flashing across his screen. The biometric scan had instantly bypassed the fake name on the forged passport and matched Terrence's facial structure directly to a severe, high-priority federal flight risk database. "Sir, I need you to step to the side." The officer commanded, his hand immediately dropping to the heavy black radio clipped to his shoulder. Terrence did not step to the side. Pure, unadulterated terror violently hijacked his brain. He snatched his hand back, leaving the fake passport on the podium, and turned to run. He shoved a middle-aged woman out of his way, wildly attempting to sprint back through the crowded security line toward the terminal exit. He did not make it 5 feet. Before Terrence could even process the incoming threat, 4 heavily armed Customs and Border Protection officers swarmed him from every single direction. A massive, muscular officer tackled him violently from behind, driving Terrence face first directly into the hard-polished airport floor. The heavy impact knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. "Stop resisting," an officer roared, pressing a heavy knee aggressively into the center of Terrence's back. Terrence gasped for air, his face smashed painfully against the cold tile. He felt cold, heavy steel handcuffs snap brutally tight around his wrists, completely immobilizing his arms. Hundreds of shocked passengers gasped and pulled their children away, forming a massive, terrified circle around the violent apprehension. Dozens of smartphone cameras instantly pointed down at him, recording his absolute miserable destruction. "You are in direct violation of a federal travel ban," the lead officer shouted, hauling Terrence roughly to his feet by the back of his gray hoodie. "You are under arrest for attempting to flee federal prosecution, possessing fraudulent identification documents, and violating the strict terms of your bail agreement." Terrence's legs gave out entirely. He went completely limp, his arrogant founder facade entirely shattered into a million pathetic pieces. The officers dragged him forcefully through the crowded, brightly lit terminal. Hundreds of strangers watched in absolute silence as the fake technology genius was hauled away in cold steel chains, his desperate, cowardly escape completely annihilated by the very digital technology he had pretended to invent. The massive oak doors of the Dirksen Federal Courthouse swung shut with a heavy, echoing thud that signaled the absolute end of my parents' reign. The courtroom was a freezing, cavernous space lined with dark wood and dominated by the intimidating seal of the United States government. I sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by my grandfather Harrison and my ruthless attorney Vivian Cole. Across the aisle, sitting at the defense table, were Richard and Linda. They looked completely stripped of their former country club arrogance. My father wore a cheap, wrinkled suit, a far cry from his tailored executive wardrobe, My mother sat beside him, her face pale, her expensive highlights fading into dull gray roots. The federal prosecutor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a voice like shattering glass, stood before the jury box. She did not waste a single breath on pleasantries. She methodically painted a devastating portrait of unparalleled greed. She walked the jury through the forged, durable power of attorney, the illegal transfer of the Michigan Avenue penthouse, and the coordinated wire fraud that had crossed state lines. She displayed the bank records, showing how my parents had drained their own retirement accounts to fund Terrence and his fraudulent commercial loan. The jury listened in absolute stunned silence as the prosecutor described how a supposedly wealthy, respectable logistics executive had systematically plotted to financially execute his own eldest daughter, just to maintain a pathetic illusion of high society status for his golden child. Then the bailiff called my name. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my tailored charcoal blazer. I walked past the wooden swinging gate and stepped up into the witness box. I raised my right hand, swore to tell the whole truth, and sat down. The microphone picked up the steady, calm rhythm of my breathing. For the very first time in my 33 years of life, I was looking down at my father from a position of absolute, undeniable power. Richard stared up at me from the defense table. He tried to muster that old, terrifying glare, the exact same look he used to use when I was a teenager asking for help with my college tuition. He wanted me to cower. He wanted me to remember my place at the bottom of his twisted family hierarchy. I did not break eye contact. I stared back at him with eyes as cold and unforgiving as the Chicago winter. I watched his fragile, arrogant facade crack right there in the middle of the federal courtroom. The prosecutor approached the podium. She asked me to state my name and my relationship to the defendants. She asked me to describe the exact moment I learned my signature had been forged to steal a $1.5 million trust fund asset. I spoke clearly, my voice projecting through the massive room without a single tremor. I recounted the birthday brunch at the Michelin star restaurant. I detailed how my mother had viciously mocked my cheap clothes while I was secretly living in a flooded, moldy basement apartment. I explained how they had dragged me into a public bathroom, threatening to destroy my freelance design career if I did not willingly hand over my stolen inheritance to Madison and Terrence. I laid out every single detail of their cruelty, their emotional manipulation, and their relentless exploitation. I told the jury exactly how it felt to work 70 hours a week, burning my eyes out in front of a computer screen, while my parents bought my sister a brand new sports car and a six-figure destination wedding. I explained that my parents had conditioned me to believe I was a profound disappointment simply because I chose to build my own independent design business instead of conforming to their shallow corporate expectations. The courtroom was dead silent. Several jurors were glaring openly at Richard and Linda. My mother had her face buried in her trembling hands, quietly sobbing, but it was far too late for theatrical tears to save her. When the prosecutor finished, Richard's desperate defense attorney approached the podium for cross-examination. He was sweating heavily, knowing his client was standing on the edge of a massive federal cliff. He decided to use the only pathetic strategy he had left. He attempted a brutal character assassination. "You claim your parents abandoned you financially?" The defense attorney began, raising his voice to sound intimidating. "But isn't it true, Riley, that you are simply a bitter, ungrateful child? Is it not true that you grew jealous of your sister's successful marriage and decided to weaponize a simple family misunderstanding to steal your parents' hard-earned wealth? You are trying to send the people who raised you, who fed you, and who housed you to a federal penitentiary just because you want a bigger piece of the pie." I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger. I just looked at the desperate lawyer with profound pity. Before I could even answer, the federal prosecutor stood up, holding a massive, meticulously organized digital file that Vivian Cole had personally handed over to the government. "Objection, Your Honor," the prosecutor announced. "The defense is deliberately mischaracterizing the financial relationship between the witness and the defendants. We request permission to enter Exhibit F into the official record." The judge nodded. The massive projector screens mounted on the courtroom walls instantly flickered to life. The screens displayed a highly detailed, comprehensive audit of my entire banking history, stretching back exactly 15 years. The prosecutor walked right up to the jury box. "Let the record reflect the absolute truth," she declared, pointing sharply at the glowing screens. "These are the certified financial records of Riley Anderson since the exact day she turned 18. Look closely at the incoming transfer columns. There is not a single dollar, not one single cent transferred from Richard or Linda Anderson. The witness paid her entire $60,000 college tuition by working double shifts as a waitress and taking on predatory student loans. She has paid every single rent check, every grocery bill, and every medical expense with money she earned entirely on her own. Her parents did not just cut her off financially, they actively stole from her to fund their preferred daughter." The defense attorney froze at the podium. His mouth hung open as he stared at the undeniable monumental proof of my absolute independence. The entire narrative he had just tried to spin evaporated into thin air. Richard buried his face in his hands, completely broken. Linda let out a loud, pathetic wail. The jury looked at the screens, then looked at my parents with pure, unadulterated disgust. I sat in the witness box, breathing in the cold, sterile air of the courtroom, knowing with absolute certainty that I had just nailed the lid of their coffin completely shut. The jury deliberation was agonizingly short. A federal jury does not need days to deliberate when they are presented with an overwhelming mountain of irrefutable paper trails, blatantly forged signatures, and crystal-clear wiretap confessions. The heavy oak door of the deliberation room swung open less than 4 hours after they had retired. The 12 men and women filed back into the freezing, cavernous federal courtroom, their faces completely unreadable, deliberately refusing to make a single second of eye contact with the defense table. I sat perfectly still in the front row of the gallery, flanked by my grandfather Harrison and my ruthless attorney Vivian Cole. The suffocating silence in the massive room was broken only by the sharp, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. The federal judge, a stern, imposing man with absolutely zero tolerance for white-collar entitlement, ordered the defendants to rise and face the jury box. Richard stood up on trembling legs. The tailored, expensive designer suit he had worn so arrogantly on the first day of the trial was now visibly wrinkled, smelling of stale sweat and sheer, unadulterated panic. Linda clung desperately to his arm, openly sobbing, her expensive makeup completely ruined and running down her pale cheeks. The court clerk took the official verdict form from the jury foreman and began reading the absolute, unequivocal destruction of my parents' lives directly into the microphone. On the charge of federal wire fraud, we find the defendant, Richard Thomas Anderson, guilty. On the charge of aggravated identity theft, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of criminal conspiracy, we find the defendant guilty. The word guilty echoed through the massive chamber like a relentless mechanical hammer, striking a coffin nail over and over again. My father's face drained of all remaining color, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. Terrence was not standing at that specific defense table today, but his miserable fate had been permanently sealed earlier that same week in a separate but deeply connected proceeding. Despite his desperate, cowardly attempt to play the victim and wear a federal wire to rat out my father, the prosecutors did not let him walk away clean. His massive commercial bank fraud was simply too severe to ignore. Terrence had been handed a solid 4-year sentence in a federal correctional institution, effectively annihilating his fake billionaire startup founder persona forever. He was already sitting in a concrete cell, entirely stripped of his tailored tuxedos, his stolen Rolex watches, and his fraudulent identity. Now it was Richard and Linda's turn to face the absolute music. The federal judge adjusted his glasses and stared down from the high bench at my parents with a look of profound, visceral disgust. In all my years on the federal bench, the judge began, his voice laced with heavy, undeniable venom. I have presided over highly complex corporate embezzlement cases and massive multi-million-dollar financial schemes. But the sheer malicious cruelty displayed in this courtroom over the past week is genuinely breathtaking. You did not just defraud a major financial institution, you financially executed your own flesh and blood. You stole her rightful inheritance to aggressively fund a pathetic, shallow illusion of high society wealth. You weaponized your parental authority to commit severe federal felonies against a daughter who owed you absolutely nothing. Richard flinched violently, as if he had been physically struck across the jaw. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but the judge raised a hand, instantly silencing him. The judge did not hesitate for a single second. Richard Anderson, for the crimes of federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft, I sentence you to 60 months, exactly 5 years, in a federal penitentiary. Furthermore, there is no parole in the federal system. You will serve every single day of that sentence behind bars. Richard's knees completely buckled. 2 massive United States Marshals immediately stepped forward from the shadows of the courtroom, grabbing his arms forcefully and restraining him before he could collapse onto the polished wooden floor. The sharp, heavy, metallic clicking of cold steel handcuffs, ratcheting tightly around my father's wrists, echoed sharply through the room. The judge turned his furious, unyielding gaze directly to my mother. Linda Anderson, due to your lack of prior criminal history and your secondary accessory role in the actual forgery process itself, you will narrowly avoid a prison cell today. I sentence you to 3 years of strict federal probation and 1,000 hours of mandatory supervised community service. If you violate a single minor term of this probation, or if you attempt to contact the victim, you will immediately join your husband in federal custody. Linda let out a horrific, piercing wail, sinking back into her heavy wooden chair and burying her face in her shaking hands. She realized she was not going to prison, but she was entirely alone, stripped of the husband who had funded her luxurious country club lifestyle for decades. But the judge was not finished. The criminal sentences and the steel handcuffs were just the appetizer. The real catastrophic devastation was the ultimate financial execution. A prison sentence pays your debt to society, the judge declared, his heavy wooden gavel resting firmly on the sounding block. But a prison sentence does not pay your debt to your victim. Pursuant to federal law, I am issuing an immediate, comprehensive, and non-negotiable restitution order. You are legally mandated to repay the entirety of the stolen trust fund, plus severe federal penalties, legal fees, and accumulated interest. The judge leaned forward, staring directly at my hyperventilating mother and my handcuffed father. Because the thorough financial audit proves that you possess absolutely zero liquid capital to satisfy this massive federal debt, this court is forcefully placing both of you into immediate involuntary. Chapter 7: Bankruptcy. Every single physical asset you possess will be aggressively seized and liquidated by a court-appointed federal trustee. Your luxury vehicles, your frozen bank accounts, your designer jewelry, and your sprawling suburban mansion will be stripped from you and put up for a public sheriff auction. Every single penny generated from the forced, humiliating sale of your entire life will be handed directly back to Riley to make her whole. You are leaving this courtroom with absolutely nothing. The federal conviction of Richard Anderson acted like a massive, unstoppable wrecking ball through the entirety of the civil litigation process. The civil court judge looked at the overwhelming mountain of criminal evidence, the blatantly forged power of attorney, and the damning wiretap transcripts, and immediately granted a summary judgment in my favor. There was no drawn-out legal battle. There was no dramatic courtroom showdown for the property deed. Just a swift, brutal, and highly efficient execution of justice. Less than 48 hours after my father exchanged his tailored designer suits for a standard-issue federal prison uniform, I stood in the foyer of Vivian Cole Law Firm, holding a brand-new ironclad property deed bearing my name and my name alone. The transition from a freezing, flooded suburban basement to the $1.5 million Michigan Avenue penthouse was profoundly surreal. I walked into the sprawling, echoing living room where Madison had arrogantly hosted her fake high society gala just months prior. The federal authorities and the bankruptcy trustees had already swept through the premises, seizing whatever luxury furniture and electronics Terrence had not managed to stuff into his duffel bag before his humiliating arrest at the airport. The space was entirely bare, stripped of their toxic presence, echoing with the quiet, untouchable peace of absolute victory. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering Chicago skyline, breathing in the crisp, clean air of a life finally reclaimed. The very first thing I did was hire a premium security firm to install impenetrable biometric locks on every single door. The spectacular public downfall of my father did not just restore my stolen inheritance, it completely resurrected my professional reputation from the dead. Richard was no longer a powerful, intimidating logistics executive who could snap his fingers and destroy my livelihood through his corrupt country club network. He was a disgraced, convicted felon sitting in a concrete cell. The moment the news of his severe federal sentencing hit the Chicago business journals, my silent smartphone suddenly erupted into a relentless, frantic frenzy of activity. The exact same corporate directors and wealthy tech clients who had cowardly sent me those cold, legally sanitized contract termination emails were now desperately attempting to claw their way back into my good graces. My inbox was instantly flooded with groveling, pathetic apologies, heavily disguised as professional misunderstandings. The executives blamed internal miscommunications, rogue human resource departments, and temporary budget constraints. They sent extravagant apology gifts, massive floral arrangements, and heavy wooden crates of vintage champagne directly to my new penthouse address, practically begging me to reinstate their user experience design contracts. They knew the power dynamic had completely shifted. I was no longer a desperate freelancer starving in a basement, terrified of losing a paycheck. I was the sole heir to a massive real estate trust fund who had just legally annihilated a prominent corporate executive without breaking a single sweat. I held absolute power, and those ruthless corporate directors could smell it. I did not ignore their frantic emails. I did not let them off the hook easily. I scheduled video conferences with every single director who had previously abandoned me under my father's threats. I sat in my luxurious, sunlit penthouse looking directly into my high-definition webcam with a cold, predatory smile. I politely informed them that my independent design agency was currently accepting new corporate clients. However, I explained that my premium digital design rates had officially tripled due to overwhelming market demand and my highly elevated industry status. Not a single executive dared to negotiate or complain about the massive price hike. They eagerly signed the heavy new contracts, desperate to associate themselves with a rising, untouchable force in the digital design industry. They happily wired massive retainer fees directly into my business accounts. I was no longer just surviving the daily grind. I was building a highly lucrative, unstoppable empire directly on the ashes of my father-ruined reputation. 2 weeks into my newly reclaimed, wildly successful life, I received an urgent calendar invitation from Vivian Cole. I drove my newly purchased luxury sedan downtown and walked into her intimidating corner office. Grandpa Harrison was present via a secure video link from his sprawling estate in Florida, sipping his morning coffee with an expression of profound, undeniable grandfatherly pride. Vivian was sitting behind her massive mahogany desk, looking remarkably pleased with herself. She did not have the usual towering stacks of thick civil litigation binders. Instead, she had a single brightly colored manila folder resting perfectly in the center of her desk. Vivian leaned forward, folding her hands neatly over the folder, her eyes gleaming with a terrifying, calculated brilliance. The federal bankruptcy trustee has officially finished auditing your parents' completely decimated financial portfolio. She announced, her voice ringing with sheer, lethal satisfaction. As per the strict federal restitution order handed down by the judge, the United States government is forcefully liquidating every single physical asset Richard and Linda Anderson ever owned to repay the money they stole from your trust fund. They have already seized and auctioned off Linda's expensive jewelry collection, her country club shares, and the remaining luxury vehicles. Vivian slid the brightly colored folder across the polished wood of the mahogany desk. I opened it and stared down at a glossy, officially stamped legal notice. It was a public auction listing. The high-resolution photograph on the front page displayed the sprawling, custom-built suburban mansion where I had grown up. It was the exact same house where I was treated like a worthless peasant while Madison was crowned the golden child. It was the ultimate towering symbol of my parents' toxic arrogance and their desperate, pathetic obsession with high society status. The federal government has officially evicted your mother, leaving her entirely homeless, and the property has been completely cleared out, Vivian stated, a brilliant calculating spark lighting up her sharp eyes. The bank is putting the mansion on the block at the Cook County Sheriff auction next Tuesday morning, because they need to liquidate it immediately to satisfy your massive federal restitution order. The opening bid is set at a terrifyingly cheap, absolute rock-bottom price. The Cook County Sheriff auction was held in a stark, heavily fluorescent-lit municipal building that smelled distinctly of stale coffee and administrative despair. I walked through the heavy glass double doors wearing a custom-tailored emerald green power suit that cost more than my entire first year of college tuition. My designer heels clicked with a lethal rhythmic authority against the scuffed linoleum floor. Vivian Cole walked perfectly in step beside me, carrying a sleek leather briefcase containing certified federal bank drafts. I was no longer the exhausted, terrified freelancer begging for scraps in a flooded suburban basement. I was an apex predator stepping directly into a room full of scavengers. The auction hall was packed tightly with aggressive real estate developers, property flippers, and bargain hunters searching for distressed assets to exploit. I scanned the crowded, noisy room and instantly spotted them cowering in the far back corner. Linda and Madison looked completely and utterly unrecognizable. The devastating reality of federal bankruptcy had brutally stripped away their arrogant country club veneer. My mother was wearing a faded, generic trench coat, her posture hunched, fragile, and utterly defeated. Madison stood closely beside her, looking absolutely miserable and gaunt in a cheap, unbranded sweater. They were frantically whispering to a tall, silver-haired man I immediately recognized from my childhood. It was Arthur Hughes, a wealthy commercial real estate developer, and one of my father's most loyal former golfing buddies. My mother was desperately clinging to the sleeve of Arthur's expensive wool suit. Even from across the crowded room, I could read the pathetic, highly delusional strategy playing out on her tear-stained face. Linda and Madison were begging him to act as a straw buyer. They wanted this wealthy family friend to purchase their foreclosed mansion at a steep discount and quietly rent it back to them for pennies on the dollar. They were still desperately trying to cling to their wealthy suburban illusion, praying a high society bailout would magically save them from the brutal incoming reality of low-income public housing. I watched with pure glacial satisfaction as Arthur gently but firmly removed my mother's shaking hand from his expensive jacket. He took a deliberate, highly visible step backward, shaking his head with a look of intense discomfort. Nobody in the Chicago financial district wanted absolutely anything to do with the radioactive fallout of my father's massive federal fraud conviction. Arthur turned his back on them without a single word of comfort and walked quickly away. He left Linda and Madison completely isolated in the freezing corner of the auction hall, abandoned by the very social circle they had sacrificed my entire life to impress. The auctioneer stepped up to the heavy wooden podium and adjusted the screeching microphone. The room quieted down immediately as he read the legal description of the massive suburban estate. Because the property was being aggressively liquidated by the federal government to satisfy my massive restitution order, the starting bid was set at a terrifyingly low baseline. It was barely a fraction of what the custom-built mansion was actually worth on the open market. Linda let out a choked, audible sob as she heard her beloved luxury fortress priced like a cheap, abandoned foreclosure. The bidding opened rapidly. Several aggressive property flippers in the front row immediately raised their numbered paddles into the air. The price steadily climbed, but it remained incredibly low for such an affluent neighborhood. I stood perfectly still at the back of the room, with Vivian, my arms crossed comfortably over my tailored green suit. I did not move a single muscle. I just watched my mother and sister staring frantically around the room, praying that Arthur or any of their former wealthy friends would raise a paddle to save them. Not a single person from their old high society life lifted a finger. The flippers slowly stopped bidding as the price reached their maximum profit margins. The auctioneer called out the current bid, scanning the silent room for any final challengers. Going once. Going twice. I slowly uncrossed my arms and raised my bright yellow bitter paddle high into the cold air. My voice rang out clear, sharp, and unwavering across the silent municipal hall. I called out a massive, overwhelming cash bid that instantly shattered the profit margins of every single real estate flipper in the room. The entire hall turned around to stare at me. Linda and Madison heads snapped in my direction so fast I thought their necks would break. Their eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as they finally realized exactly who was hijacking the auction. I was not just bidding with my rapidly expanding corporate user experience design revenue. I was bidding with the highly lucrative, fully restored trust fund that my parents had desperately tried to steal. I was using the exact same financial weapon they had forged to destroy me. I stared directly into my mother-terrified, bloodshot eyes as the auctioneer frantically checked to see if anyone else would counter my astronomical cash offer. The property flippers aggressively shook their heads and lowered their paddles, completely intimidated by my overwhelming financial leverage. They knew a federal trust fund baby when they saw one, and they knew they could not outbid my sheer vindictive capital. The auctioneer raised his heavy wooden gavel high into the air. Sold to the bidder in the green suit, he announced loudly, bringing the gavel down with a sharp, definitive crack that echoed through the room like a gunshot. The hammer strike legally transferred the absolute ownership of the sprawling suburban mansion directly into my hands. I had just purchased my childhood home, the grand, imposing fortress of my parents' toxic arrogance and extreme favoritism, for a shockingly cheap, severely discounted price. I bought it using the exact restitution money the federal judge had squeezed from their liquidated assets. Linda legs completely gave out. She collapsed against the back wall of the auction hall, sliding down to the dirty linoleum floor, weeping with loud, uncontrollable agony. Madison stood frozen above her, staring at me with a look of profound, devastating realization. They finally understood the absolute ruthless symmetry of their brutal punishment. They were officially homeless, and I was the sole legal landlord of their ruined empire. I did not offer them a single ounce of sympathy or a single comforting glance. I turned to Vivian, handed her my yellow bitter paddle, and smiled a cold, victorious smile. We turned our backs on my weeping mother and my shattered sister, walking confidently out of the auction hall to finalize the paperwork on my brand new, heavily discounted real estate acquisition. 4 months passed since the auctioneer gavel finalized my ultimate victory. I never packed a single box to move my belongings into the sprawling suburban mansion. Living inside the walls where I had been systematically abused was out of the question. I bought that massive estate to completely erase the toxic history it represented. I hired a commercial demolition crew on my very first day of legal ownership. I stood on the front lawn in a tailored trench coat, sipping a hot latte, watching with absolute satisfaction as heavy construction machinery rolled straight up the pristine brick driveway. I directed the demolition foreman to start with my mother-formal living room. I watched through the massive bay windows as men carrying heavy sledgehammers brutally smashed through the custom crown molding and the imported marble fireplace where Linda used to host her pretentious country club luncheons. The pristine space where I had been endlessly mocked was instantly reduced to a massive pile of jagged rubble and white drywall dust. Next was the Golden Child Sanctuary. I requested that the crew completely gut Madison's overly indulgent master bedroom suite. The expensive walk-in closet where she had hoarded designer dresses bought with my stolen trust fund money was violently torn down to the bare wooden studs. The walls were entirely knocked out, opening up the compartmentalized floor plan into a sprawling, modern, industrial space. The physical destruction of their arrogant suburban fortress was intensely therapeutic. By the end of the 4th month, The commercial renovation was fully completed. The once hostile family mansion had been transformed into the corporate headquarters for my expanding user experience design agency. The layout was now an open collaborative tech hub, featuring sleek glass partitions, polished concrete floors, and brilliant natural sunlight pouring through the newly expanded windows. Where the heavy mahogany dining table used to sit, I installed a massive high-tech conference room. I did not just build a beautiful office space, I built an ecosystem of opportunity. Using the influx of corporate contracts I secured after Richard federal fraud conviction, I aggressively expanded my business operations. I hired 3 dozen young, brilliant digital designers and software developers. Most of them were talented creatives who had been unfairly overlooked by corporate firms. People who knew exactly what it felt like to grind for every single dollar they earned. I gave them excellent salaries, comprehensive health benefits, and a luxurious environment to build their careers. I walked through the vibrant hallways of my new agency, listening to the energetic hum of clicking keyboards and enthusiastic brainstorming sessions. My employees were actively collaborating on massive digital campaigns for international tech giants, completely oblivious to the miserable history that had previously stained this exact property. I had taken a monument of toxic entitlement and completely flipped it into a thriving engine of modern innovation. I was an absolute titan in my industry, sitting at the top of an empire I built entirely with my own 2 hands. While I was aggressively scaling my design firm, Madison was experiencing a completely different reality check. The federal government had entirely liquidated her stolen assets. Terrence was locked away in a federal penitentiary, having abandoned her with a mountain of legal fees and zero legitimate work experience. My parents were bankrupt, living in a heavily subsidized apartment in an undesirable zip code, utterly incapable of providing their golden child with a financial bailout. Madison was forced to enter the unforgiving workforce without a fake corporate title to prop up her ego. She managed to secure employment as a waitress at a dingy coffee shop on the industrial outskirts of the city. Her daily reality now consisted of wearing a cheap, heavily stained polyester uniform apron and scrubbing sticky tables for minimum wage. The perfectly manicured fingernails she used to tap arrogantly against her designer handbags were now chipped ragged and permanently smelling of cheap industrial bleach. On a freezing Tuesday afternoon, Madison finished an exhausting double shift at the cafe. Her ancient used car had broken down 2 days prior, forcing her to rely on the notoriously unreliable city bus system. She wrapped her thin, frayed coat tightly around her shoulders, shivering violently as she walked down the wet gray sidewalk. Due to a sudden detour on her bus route, she found herself walking directly through the affluent, heavily manicured suburban neighborhood where she had spent her entire spoiled, entitled life. Madison trudged past the tall, perfectly sculpted hedges and the sprawling green lawns, her cheap sneakers soaking through with freezing puddle water. She kept her head down, utterly terrified that one of her former wealthy neighbors might drive past in a luxury vehicle and recognize the golden child reduced to a miserable, exhausted waitress. Her legs ached profoundly as she approached the familiar intersection. She stopped dead in her tracks, her breath hitching painfully in her tight chest. She was standing directly in front of our old family estate. Madison stared through the heavy custom-forged iron gates, her eyes widening in sheer unadulterated shock and profound humiliation. The property was completely unrecognizable. The arrogant, pristine facade of the mansion had been modernized with sleek architectural steel and dark-tinted glass. A row of expensive electric vehicles sat neatly parked in the completely repaved driveway. The front doors were wide open and stylish, successful young professionals were walking in and out with briefcases and laptops. But it was the massive, brand-new sign mounted directly onto the heavy iron gates that completely broke her fragile, delusional mind. The gleaming custom-brushed steel letters sparkled arrogantly in the cold afternoon sunlight. Madison stood on the wet, dirty sidewalk, shivering uncontrollably in her stained waitress uniform, and stared at the towering, undeniable proof of my absolute victory. The heavy metal sign proudly displayed the name of my highly lucrative multi-million-dollar user experience design agency. It was an unmistakable permanent monument to her total destruction. The freezing winds of Lake Michigan whipped across the massive glass balcony of the downtown Chicago penthouse. I stood near the heavy steel railing with a crystal glass of vintage red wine resting comfortably in my hand. The sprawling, glittering grid of the city stretched out infinitely below me, a breathtaking ocean of golden lights and towering skyscrapers. I was standing hundreds of feet above the dark, damp, flooded suburban basement, where I had spent years desperately coding user interfaces and surviving on cheap coffee. I was finally breathing the crisp, clean air of the absolute summit. The transition from the miserable bottom of the family hierarchy to the literal top of the Chicago skyline was a profound, undeniable reality. I had fought tooth and nail through a brutal storm of emotional abuse, severe federal fraud, and unparalleled greed, and I had emerged entirely victorious. Grandpa Harrison sat comfortably in a custom leather armchair just a few feet away, securely wrapped in a thick wool coat against the biting evening chill. He looked incredibly peaceful, his sharp eyes reflecting the brilliant city lights. He took a slow, appreciative sip of his own wine and let out a deep, satisfied sigh. We had spent the entire afternoon reviewing the final legal documents from Vivian Cole, officially closing the book on the federal restitution and the absolute bankruptcy of my parents. The trust fund was fully restored, protected by ironclad legal barriers, and my user experience design agency was generating a massive, unprecedented amount of revenue. "You built an absolute fortress," Riley Grandpa Harrison said, his voice carrying a heavy, resonant pride that warmed me against the freezing wind. "You did not just survive their malicious attempts to destroy your future, you completely dismantled their fraudulent empire and used the wreckage to pave your own highway. I have spent my entire life evaluating business deals and measuring the resilience of ambitious entrepreneurs, and I can say with absolute certainty that I have never been more proud of anyone in my entire life." I smiled a genuine, completely unburdened smile and leaned back against the heavy glass railing. "I did not do it entirely alone, Grandpa," I replied, holding my crystal glass up toward him. "You gave me the initial foundation and you stood right beside me when I had to face down a federal courtroom. You showed me what actual, unconditional family support looks like." He nodded slowly, a fierce, protective glint in his elderly eyes. "You earned every single victory with your own two hands and your brilliant mind," he stated firmly. "You used the rigid, unforgiving power of the federal law to execute absolute justice. You did not resort to their dirty, manipulative tactics. You operated with total integrity, and that is exactly why you are standing on this luxury balcony, while they are facing the brutal, agonizing consequences of their own actions." Before I could respond to his profound statement, the sharp, sudden vibration of my smartphone broke the peaceful silence of the balcony. The device was resting on the sleek glass patio table between us. The bright screen illuminated the dark evening, displaying a new text message from a completely unknown, unsaved phone number. I set my wine glass down next to the phone and picked up the device. I stared at the glowing screen, my eyes scanning the short, desperate cluster of words. "Riley, please, it is your mother. I am out of money for my blood pressure medicine and the public clinic is closed. Madison cannot help me because she lost her waitress job yesterday. I am freezing and I feel sick. Please, I am begging you, just wire me $50. Just $50 to help your mother." I stood perfectly still on the luxurious balcony, reading the pathetic, groveling message sent by a woman who had happily forged my signature to steal a $1.5 million property. I read the desperate plea of a woman who had publicly called me a worthless failure, who had ruthlessly mocked my freelance career, and who had gleefully financed my sister's arrogant lifestyle using my stolen identity. Linda was reduced to begging for $50 from an unknown prepaid phone number, shivering in whatever cheap federally subsidized housing unit she had been forced into after her sprawling suburban mansion was auctioned off to me. Grandpa Harrison watched my face carefully, his sharp eyes catching the faint glow of the phone screen. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice steady and watchful. I looked away from the glowing screen and stared out at the magnificent sprawling city skyline. I waited for the familiar conditioned surge of childhood guilt to hit my chest. I waited for the heavy, suffocating feeling of familial obligation that had controlled my actions for 33 years. I waited to feel a shred of pity for the woman who had given birth to me. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in my veins. There was no sadness, no regret, and absolutely no mercy. The emotional manipulation cord had been permanently severed by the gavel of a federal judge and the ruthless clarity of my own self-worth. Linda was no longer my mother. She was just a convicted federal accessory to wire fraud who had gambled her entire life on a fake tech startup and lost everything. "No problem at all," I replied, my voice completely light and entirely free of any emotional burden. "Just a spam message." I looked down at the screen one last time. I did not type a single letter in response. I did not demand an apology or offer a harsh, vindictive lecture. I simply pressed my thumb against the screen, navigated to the security settings, and hit the block contact button. The unknown number instantly vanished into the digital void, permanently erased from my existence. I placed the phone face down on the glass table, completely detaching myself from the miserable, ruined lives of Richard, Linda Madison, and Terrence. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, and I was never looking back. I picked up my glass of vintage wine and turned back to my grandfather, the cold Chicago wind whipping through my hair. I raised my glass high into the air, the crystal catching the ambient light of the penthouse. I actually received a massive email right before we stepped out onto the balcony. I announced, a bright, victorious laugh escaping my lips. The chief executive officer of that major Silicon Valley tech firm officially signed the corporate contract. My design agency is taking over their entire global user experience overhaul. It is the biggest, most lucrative financial contract I have ever secured in my entire life. Grandpa Harrison's face erupted into a massive, triumphant smile. He raised his own glass, tapping it gently against mine with a crisp, melodic clink that sounded like pure, unadulterated freedom. "To the absolute top of the world," Riley, he declared, his voice full of joy. "To the top of the world," I echoed, taking a long, satisfying sip of the rich red wine. I stood on the balcony of my multi-million-dollar fortress, surrounded by the dazzling lights of the city I had conquered. I had built a massive, untouchable empire, using nothing but my own brilliant mind, my relentless work ethic, and the absolute crushing power of the law. I was entirely safe. I was immensely powerful, and I was finally permanently free. The most profound lesson to draw from Riley's journey is that sharing DNA does not give anyone the right to exploit, manipulate, or destroy you. Society often conditions us to believe that family requires unconditional loyalty, forcing individuals to swallow their pain and sacrifice their own well-being just to maintain a fragile, toxic peace. However, this story completely shatters that dangerous illusion. It teaches us that when abusive relatives view your empathy as a weakness and your quiet resilience as an open invitation for exploitation, setting ironclad boundaries is not an act of betrayal, it is an absolute necessity for your own survival. Furthermore, the narrative highlights the undeniable life-saving power of financial and emotional independence. Riley survived the ultimate betrayal because she spent her entire adult life building a fortress with her own two hands. By paying her own way, grinding through 70-hour work weeks in a flooded basement, and refusing to rely on her parents' highly conditional handouts, she ensured they had zero leverage over her when the truth finally came to light. True security does not come from high society status, stolen assets, or fake corporate titles. It comes from the unshakable competence, integrity, and grit you cultivate within yourself. Finally, the story proves that the ultimate revenge is never about lowering yourself to the malicious level of your abusers. It is about stepping aside, allowing the swift and uncompromising hammer of natural consequences to fall exactly where it belongs, and focusing entirely on elevating your own life. You are never obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. By cutting the heavy cord of guilt and walking away from those who constantly belittle your worth, you free yourself to reach the absolute summit of your own potential. If you have ever had to break free from toxic expectations to build your own independent empire, share your story of resilience in the comments below, and do not forget to hit like and subscribe for more empowering journeys.